Ready? Did you everybody got their makeup on? No, I'm just kidding. Looking good. Huh? That's okay. He'll have to join. Okay, everyone, we are going to get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's hearing on blood-related injuries from COVID-19 vaccination. I want to especially thank our witnesses today, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Ryan Cole, and Dr. Kirk Milhoan, for making the time in their busy lives to be here with us today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I would also like to thank Senator Johnson for joining me once again, in truly doing the people's work and trying to get to the bottom of the detrimental effects of the COVID vaccine that the government forced on so many Americans. And I want to thank all of the Americans watching this hearing today. So thank you for being engaged, including the countless Americans who have themselves been injured by one of these vaccines or have lost a loved one to them that should have never happened. The reason why I'm holding yet another hearing on COVID-19 vaccines, despite being a member of the COVID-19 Select Committee, is because our committee refuses to do anything about what Americans actually care about. We all know that COVID came from a Chinese lab in Wuhan. We don't need to investigate the origins of COVID anymore. We need to look at the data, of which there is so much that shows the vaccines hurt or killed thousands of Americans, and then also what is COVID going to continue doing to people. The vaccine adverse events reporting system has seen a massive spike in reports following the rollout of the COVID vaccines. So many people have been affected, yet politicians here in Washington are too afraid to do anything about it. Well, our job is to care about the issues our constituents care about. For me, it's the people of Northwest Georgia. For Senator Johnson, it's the people of Wisconsin. Why is it that so many members of Congress are scared to talk about the issues their constituents care about? Well, I'll tell you, many of them, including doctors, are afraid of generating vaccine hesitancy. But I am afraid of the prospects of thousands, if not more, Americans getting injured or dying from these vaccines. Given the overwhelming data, people should be hesitant about injecting unproven vaccines in their bodies. Even though I'm not a doctor, I know that it's unscientific to ignore the data. Some members of Congress are afraid to upset their friends in Big Pharma, who sell the disease and then sell the cure. And their friends in Congress, in turn, force Americans to pay for it. This is how Washington works in many cases. Special interests get help from politicians, and they both end up enriching themselves. They don't care how many Americans get hurt. They don't care how many taxpayer dollars are spent. They just exploit, exploit, exploit. With this hearing and the other ones I will continue to hold, I hope to give a voice to the Americans who are sick and tired of being exploited by their elected representatives. The work of restoring the people's voice in Washington continues right here and right now. Today, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. And gentlemen, I would like to go one at a time and give you a chance to introduce yourself for our hearing. Dr. Cole, we can start with you.
Thank you, Representative Greene, and it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate everything you're doing for your constituents and for the American people. I'm Dr. Ryan Cole. I'm a board-certified anatomic and clinical pathologist trained at the Mayo Clinic. I've been in practice for over 20 years and ran an independent medical laboratory for 2 decades, and ended up having to sell that because I spoke out against this COVID narrative and got canceled by insurance companies for, quote, unprofessional behavior for telling the truth. So it's an honor to be here today. Do you want me to do an opening statement as well, or just introduction?
Of course, an opening statement.
Okay, opening statement. So, we're at an unprecedented time in American history. And it used to be that we were a nation of the people, for the people, by the people. And now we're of the corporation, for the corporation, and by the corporation. Countless Americans have been harmed because people have believed biased media. People have believed corrupt pharmaceutical narratives. Countless people in this nation are hurting and being ignored. Now, I'm a pathologist. The pathologist is the most important doctor that you never meet, that you always hope is right. So we see a part of people every day. We see your blood, we see your microbiology, we see your tissues under the microscope, and the cells don't lie. And what we've found in this unfortunate 4 years is we've been ignored. We see the damage. And later in the hearing, I have some slides that if we have time, I'll share, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. But we see what's happening to the people. And I'm tired of the American people being gaslit and being told, well, it's anything and everything, but it's not the, quote, vaccine. This is a gene transfection product that billions of people have received. And genetic products need to be monitored for a long period of time. We have countless people injured that are being ignored. And we can't do this anymore. And, I'm not here to judge people if you got 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shots, whatever. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying don't get another one. This is an unproven, unsafe product. We need to acknowledge that there's injury happening around the world, and we need to stop these products immediately, not just the COVID shots. Any mRNA platform going forward is unproven and unsafe. And this is about an oath that all of us took. We took an oath to first do no harm, primum non nocere. We take that oath seriously. Most of us sitting here have given up almost everything. So we're grateful to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask questions or answer any questions you may ask going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Dr. Peter McCullough.
Madam Chairwoman and Senator Johnson, Mr. Davidson, it's a great honor to be here, as I've been in Washington now several times. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm a practicing internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. I'm trained in public health and have a master's degree in public health and epidemiology. I'm very experienced in academic medicine. I have over 780 peer-reviewed publications cited in the National Library of Medicine. I have over 70 papers on the COVID-19 pandemic, both on many aspects of the pandemic, including early treatment and now vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths. I have been on data safety monitoring boards and interacted with the FDA and big pharma and device companies. I've interacted with the European medicine agencies as well as the MHRA in the past, lectured at virtually every medical school in the United States. I'm well known to all of them. We're 4 years into this, and this is the first time that the U.S. House of Representatives has heard from doctors who are directly treating patients with both COVID-19 and the vaccine injuries. That's 4 years too late. I think that's a very important lesson learned. I never supported these vaccines. I never told a single patient that it was safe to take a vaccine. I didn't take a COVID-19 vaccine myself because it wasn't safe. And I published an op-ed in The Hill in August of 2020, before they came out. The title of that op-ed is The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Pandemic. The reason why it was a gamble is because the vaccines, and of Americans who took the vaccine, is roughly 75% of Americans took at least 1 shot, according to the COVID States program. Of those, 94% took a messenger RNA vaccines. So we can restrict our comments to messenger RNA vaccines provided by Fizer and Moderna. These vaccines are a brand new technology that installs the genetic code for the lethal part of the virus, which is the spike protein, the spine on the surface of the virus. This was an extraordinary gamble because there was no knowledge of what was going to turn this off. Once the genetic code gets in the body, there was no knowledge of, does the body get rid of the genetic code? What shuts it off? Will some people produce too much genetic code and have it keep moving from cell to cell and too much spike protein? It was known then that the spike protein was lethal. And to give a genetic code for a potentially lethal protein that was devised in a Chinese biosecurity lab to Americans was the most dangerous proposition our government agencies could have ever put forward to our country. And what we've learned on this is extraordinary. Castriuta and colleagues has published the messenger RNA is physically circulating in the blood for at least 28 days. That's as long as they've looked. Crossan and colleagues from Harvard has shown the messenger RNA is stuck in the human heart 30 days after the vaccine when people die. And there's inflammation around it, presumably due to the spike protein. Röntgen and colleagues from Stanford have shown the messenger RNA is stuck in human lymph nodes for at least 2 months. And that's as long as they've looked. Now, the spike protein, which is produced by the messenger RNA, is widely circulatory in blood and shown by Harvard, by Ogata and colleagues, Swank, and recently Brogna in Germany. Now, Brogna in Germany looked 6 months afterwards, and at least half the people who took the shots had vaccine spike protein circulating in their bloodstream. That's as long as they've looked. And they can identify it because Pfizer and Moderna have an amino acid signature on their spike protein to let us identify. We know that it's Pfizer and Moderna. It doesn't come from the natural virus. It's coming from the vaccine. That's proven. The spike protein now, in 3,400 peer-reviewed papers and growing, is proven to cause heart damage and myocarditis. Our regulatory agencies agree. Every regulatory agency in the world agrees. There's actually guidelines now in the UK and Australia about how to diagnose and manage vaccine myocarditis. That's how common this is. It accelerates atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, causes tremendous swings in blood pressure and heart rate called posterior orthostatic tachycardia syndrome or POTS, causes neurologic injury, stroke, both ischemic and hemorrhagic, paralyzing syndromes, including Guillain-Barré syndrome, small fiber neuropathy, ear ringing. It causes blood clots. The spike protein is physically found in blood clots. The largest blood clots that we've ever seen in clinical medicine, typically a blood clot that someone would get after a hip surgery or on an airplane would be a centimeter or so. It's common in my practice. Yesterday, I saw patients with 15, 17, 2 feet blood clots in their legs.
Oh my God.
After the vaccine. We see blood clots both on the arterial side and on the venous side. This is distinctly unusual. The body is set up after the vaccine to form blood clots. And this is particularly harmful in people with a predilection to blood clots or other provocateurs, hip surgery, smoking, supplemental estrogens, prolonged immobility, etc. The fourth major category where the vaccines clearly cause injury and damage is autoimmunity. The human body recognizes the spike protein as non-human. And so the body attacks its own cells in an attempt to try to fight this. And because of this, the body then expresses markers of autoimmunity that now I routinely test in my practice. The antinuclear antibody, the ANA test, which is a test we do for systemic lupus, the anti-citrulated peptide test for rheumatoid arthritis, and then the ANCA test, the anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody test. These are now all proven in the peer-reviewed literature. These blood tests turn positive in response to the vaccine, and people develop a variety of autoimmune syndromes. This is what we're seeing clinically. So my observations are based in terms of what I'm seeing clinically, what I'm reading in the peer-reviewed literature. And in the peer-reviewed literature, large numbers of cases are being reported. I want to cite one paper from the peer-reviewed literature, Lane and colleagues, that's assembled now a series of 18,204 patients with myopericarditis. 18,000. Now, I can tell you, my whole career, I saw 2 cases before COVID-19. Now I am seeing myocarditis on a daily basis. The number of myocarditis cases in the United States before the pandemic was roughly 200 to 400 cases in the whole country per year. Now we're seeing this in the thousands, and these are limited sets. Now, of those 18,204 spontaneously reported cases, the death rate in these patients is 0.22. So fortunately, a majority of people survive, but sadly, some die. In the published papers of people describing the cases, the death rate has ranged from 0.41 for myopericarditis to 45.9%. Wow. 45.9%. Hulsher and colleagues, of which I am a senior author on this paper, is now has a paper in the preprint server. Now it's been fully accepted to the European Society of Cardiology Journal, has proven that myocarditis is fatal when autopsies are confirmed. When the doctors suspect myocarditis, there's a 100% rate of confirmation that it's fatal myocarditis. When there's general death that's occurred in a vaccinated patient, our data suggest that it's roughly 74%. If an autopsy would be done, it would be confirmed that the vaccine was the cause of death. Today, a Rasmussen poll is out, and the Rasmussen poll has shown that 53% of Americans think the COVID-19 vaccines are causing serious injuries leading to large numbers of, quote, unexplained deaths. So the word is out. I've made the call on the floor of with Senator Johnson and a panel in the U.S. Senate, multiple state senates, the European Parliament. I'm making the call today. The COVID-19 vaccines should be removed from the market. They're not safe for human use. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. Thank you very much. Dr. Milhoan.
Yes, thank you very much. What an honor it is to be here. My name is Kirk Milhoan. I am board certified in pediatrics and pediatric cardiology. Before my medical degree, I got a PhD in cardiovascular physiology and pharmacology. My thesis was on what causes inflammation in the heart. Just so happens the pathway I was studying is the exact pathway that COVID, the spike protein, causes inflammation within our body. I wanted to share what my heart is that I bring to this hearing as a physician and a scientist. And it goes back to two basic historic ancient texts. Dr. Ryan Cole already alluded to the Hippocratic Oath, which says, do no harm. So as physicians, we are called, we have taken an oath to do no harm. The second, and I consider this as I share my thoughts and my education and my experiences, comes from the Bible. And it says, the goal of my instruction is love, from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. We have, when I share what I'm seeing in my patients and throughout the literature, I share from a place of compassion, not of judgment. When we see these patients, regardless of how they've been injured, we need to bring the loving and compassionate care to bear on these people who have been injured, and we have to find a way to treat them. We can't just let them. There are too many of them, as Dr. McCullough so clearly put out. And I wanted, as he said at the end, at what Rasmussen was seeing, I wanted to share, because sometimes it's interesting to when we're facing sometimes the when we're facing something, the non-scientists often show us and they look at data a little bit differently. And a lot of times that comes from the insurance company, because the insurance company is basing their entire livelihood on well people not getting sick and knowing what percentage of well people should get sick. So Ed Dowd is one of those financial guys, and he's been looking at the insurance data. And his research team recently evaluated the data out of UK. And it was from the United Kingdom Death and Disability Trends for Cardiovascular Diseases in 15 to 44-year-olds. What's important about that statement is you shouldn't have cardiovascular disease in 15 to 44-year-olds. So if this is now a spike, this is something we really have to look at. So they found very concerning data, and I quote, "We show a large increase in the morbidity and mortality due to disease of the cardiovascular system from 2021. The increase in disability claims is consistent with the increase in excess deaths, and both are highly significant. The data show a 13% increase in excess cardiovascular death in 2020, then a 30% increase in 2021, and a 44% increase in 2022. Something significantly has increased excess cardiovascular deaths in 2021, and it continues. As humans, physicians, and scientists, we should be curious with what has happened." There's really only one major thing that happened in 2021, and that was the rollout of this untested vaccine. So as we go forward, I'll happy to answer questions and go into deeper explanations of and try to bring truth and transparency and honesty to this discussion. But thank you for making this happen.
Thank you. Powerful opening testimonies. Thank you each. I'll start with question, and then we're all going to take turns up here, and we really appreciate your honest and open answers. I'd like to start out. One of the things that's talked about is vaccine hesitancy. So I just want to ask you guys in the beginning, what is the difference? Dr. McCullough, I'll start with you. What is the difference between the old vaccines we've grown up with that we know and trust versus the mRNA vaccine that's now the COVID vaccine, but could be made into more vaccines? Could you explain that a little bit?
The existing vaccines, now they have grown in number and intensity over time. And the mothers know this on the childhood schedule. It's called the ACIP schedule. ACIP is a committee charged by the CDC to recommend what American children should receive. These conventional vaccines are either proteins, such as the tetanus toxoid or the pneumococcal protein, hepatitis B protein. And they're simply proteins that the body responds to. The proteins themselves can't cause disease. You can't get tetanus from a tetanus shot. Or they are killed viruses. So for instance, influenza is a killed virus. You get a flu shot. You can't get flu from a flu shot because the virus is killed, but people get flu-like syndrome and they get confused with this, but it's a killed virus. Or it's a live attenuated virus. That is, the virus is alive, but it's crippled and it can't cause serious disease. And an example there would be the shingles vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine. And people will know that because if they've ever had the shingles vaccine, of which I've had, one will have a very serious reaction in the arm because the virus is alive. It just can't cause full-blown shingles, but it can cause a serious reaction. All of these conventional vaccines limit the degree of which the vaccine itself can directly cause disease. Now, there are vaccine reactions, and there can be serious immune reactions to vaccines that are recognized. And they're so serious that in 1986, under the Reagan administration, the Congress and HHS wrote the vaccine injury compensation legislation, which said conventional vaccines have unavoidable harms. So even the conventional vaccines that we trust, I've taken them all, my children have taken them all, they do have unavoidable harms. And what's grown out of this is people have felt that if something has a harm, there must be freedom of choice on all forms of vaccines at every level. So no vaccine should be mandated, in my view, at any level. None of them are sufficiently compelling. None of them completely prevent the disease. The conventional vaccines actually have little data to support they block transmission. Our CDC on the website says the polio vaccine doesn't stop transmission. They said right on their website. So we don't have all the major outbreaks of pertussis and diphtheria. They all occur, mumps, they all occur when people are vaccinated. So these vaccines are not perfect, but they do provide a basis of which we try to ensure some health of our pediatric population. Messenger RNA is drastically different. Messenger RNA is the genetic code for part of a virus. And when it installs in the human body, it hijacks the body's machinery to read the genetic code called ribosomes, and then they produce an uncontrolled amount of a protein, in this case, the spike protein, for an uncontrolled duration of time. So this is very different than a tetanus shot. Tetanus shot is a specific amount of tetanus toxoid, period. The body digests this and goes away. This is genetic code that produces the spike protein, it looks like potentially indefinitely. The human body, to our knowledge, has no way of breaking down the messenger RNA and has no way of breaking down the spike protein. There are no described enzymatic pathways for the human body to dispose of this. In my view, the COVID-19 vaccine program has complicated this because people have taken unprecedented numbers of shots. If one was to follow the US government program right now, taking a shot every 6 months with the primary series, they'd be approaching 10 shots. This is unprecedented to give 10 sets of inoculations.
So let me just clarify, if the body can't break down the spike protein and they're continuing to, and they're forced, and I totally agree with you, Dr. Milhoan, we're not holding people responsible for this, that were forced to take the vaccine, people that believe they were doing the right thing. They were told over and over again on the television, you're doing the right thing. This is how you care for others. But if these people are taking these vaccines and getting boosters and so forth, what what does the spike protein do inside the body? If our bodies can't break it down, what is the spike protein doing?
It's found circulating in blood. Recent paper by former NIH researcher David Scheim suggests, based on all the data, that 40% of it is actually linked to red blood cells. So it's actually causing clumping of red blood cells. And we see micro clumps of red blood cells now in multiple studies. It's inside white blood cells. Bruce Patterson at InCellDX has shown that it's inside CDC 16 monocytes. And Dr. Cole will share with us later on, the spike protein is penetrating all the tissues in the body. So it's actually in tissue layers in the body. And it appears to be accumulating.
And it doesn't go away.
It's unknown. It's unknown. In the Brogna paper of interest, people who took Pfizer and Moderna, 50% of people who take the shots have detectable circulating spike protein. 50% don't. And in a paper by Schmeling and colleagues from Denmark of interest, 30% of people who took the shots have no side effects whatsoever. None, not even a sore arm. It looks like they don't develop side effects. Another, just under 2/3, have some modest side effects. And then in the Schmeling study, it was 4.2% of people who really get severe side effects. In our CDC vSafe data, which over 10 million Americans volunteered in the data set, 7.7% of people really get sick and have to go to the emergency room or be hospitalized. So what we've learned is the vaccines have been broadly applied. Thank goodness most people are okay. But there is a small but significant number of people who really get in trouble with the vaccines. Multiply that times a big number of people who took the shots. That's the reason why we got a health crisis.
That is a reason. Dr. Cole, I want to ask you and go further on what Dr. McCullough is talking about. There's been reports with embalmers talking about blood clots. And this has been labeled a conspiracy theory. Is this a conspiracy theory? What are you seeing as a pathologist when you're looking at tissue and you're looking at blood? In your experience, what have you seen?
Well, it's a scientific fact. It's not a conspiracy theory. And again, I have some images I can show later, but we saw during COVID increased clotting markers in patients that were sick with COVID. As Dr. McCullough mentioned, the lethal toxic part of this virus, the spike protein, has a propensity to cause blood to clump. These embalmers, I have many of these samples in my laboratory that we've looked at. These are unusual clots. And Dr. Pretorius out of South Africa, Dr. Kell out of the UK, Dr. Jordan Vaughn in Alabama have researched this, and the blood is forming a unique folding protein called amyloid. And these clots are almost like a rubber band or a rubber ball. And in pathology, you know, we use food descriptors for different things. A normal clot is kind of jelly-like in terms of consistency. These are very firm. Another important thing to piggyback on what Dr. McCullough said is compared to traditional vaccines, those you get in the arm, obviously there can be side effects from some of the chemical adjuvants. These shots, the gene is wrapped in a little fat bubble, a lipid nanoparticle. Now, if you look at the manufacturer's list of ingredients, all of these are not approved for human nor veterinary use, and yet went into billions of arms. This fat bubble can go anywhere and everywhere in the body instead of staying in the arm. So this gene wrapped in a fat bubble can land anywhere or everywhere. And that's why we're seeing the side effects in the vaccine injured that we don't traditionally see with typical vaccines. Lipid nanoparticles were designed to carry chemotherapeutic agents to the brain. So these were designed to go everywhere. And so the first place they go is circulation. And then they will, that little, like a magnet, a positive, negative charge, that fat bubble will attach to a cell, the gene will go in. Human cells are meant to make human proteins. Human cells are not meant to make foreign proteins. And when our cells start making foreign proteins, our immune system goes on high alert and says, attack, attack. And so our own immune system, our killer cells, our natural killer cells, will go in and say, this is an enemy, start destroying those cells. So we see liver damage, we see adrenal gland damage, we see brain damage, we see heart damage, we see damage of the blood vessels. So these clots are because an inflammatory response is happening in the lining of the blood vessels first and foremost. And then as the immune system reacts, there's this little waterfall cascade of this protein and this protein and this protein and this protein. I won't get into all the clotting factors. But because of this response, these clots form. And as Dr. McCullough mentioned, clinically, he's seeing in patients clots that we have not seen historically. And these are large clots, and these are firm clots, and these are hard to dissolve clots because that protein I mentioned, amyloid, is not easily broken down by the human body. And there was a study that came out just last week or so showing in some vaccine-injured patients that there's amyloid even depositing in the muscles. And that's because the muscle fibers are breaking down. So these patients with chronic fatigue, it's like the perfect poison protein, the spike protein. Does it cause clotting? Yes. Does it cause neurologic harm? Absolutely. An Italian study showed, 19,000 patient study showed that 30%, almost a third, had neurologic harms, whether it was ringing in the ears, whether it was burning, whether it was whatnot. 1/3. So as much as we hear about the blood harms, the clotting harms, the heart harms, neurologic harms are way up there. And the autoimmune harms too. And that's because we shouldn't, and this is why I'm against this whole technology platform. Use it on the research level for rare genetic conditions or for targeting certain things. But when you put something in the body that goes everywhere, and as Dr. McCullough mentioned, doesn't have an off switch, this gene doesn't have an off switch. And it isn't mRNA. It is synthetic mRNA. Researchers out of Cambridge and Oxford recently published and showed that it's not just making spike protein. It's this little message and code is slipping. And if you shift the frame when you're trying to make a protein, you may make other proteins. And that's another harm of this technology that we found out 4 years after rolling it out onto billions of people. You're not just making the spike protein alone. You may be making fragmented proteins that can cause all sorts of other harms and clotting and whatnot.
And the problem with when they start making a synthetic mRNA, once again, your body will break down regular true RNA right away. But what they're putting in the platform isn't broken down quickly. And so if it incorporates, and this is, I think, what we're seeing in some people, is they are now become a spike protein factory that doesn't stop. And we're not sure we have a way to stop it.
And gratefully, like Dr. McCullough pointed out, it's not everybody, but it's enough people that they should not be ignored.
So is it fair to say then that these vaccine manufacturers created these vaccines with the synthetic mRNA that has created diseases, heart disease, strokes, neurological problems, everything that you've talked about? Do these same vaccine manufacturers sell the cures for the diseases that they're creating? Is that a fair thing to say? Do they sell other drugs that say treat strokes or cardiovascular disease and so forth? Is that true?
I find it ironic that Fizer just spent $40 billion on a cancer treatment company. So I don't know. I'm not in their boardrooms.
I'm not accusing them of
I'm not in the
causing
boardrooms,
it,
but it's curious.
It's a fair comment that I can tell you in my clinical practice as an internist and cardiologist, I've never prescribed so many blood thinners in my career. Never. I mean, this is extraordinary. All day long, I'm confronted with blood clots of different scenarios. A paper to cite by Wu and colleagues from the FDA, Silver Springs, Maryland. A scientist at the FDA published this paper. Now it's with the Janssen vaccine, which is now off the market. But to give you an idea, they published on thousands of blood clots that the FDA knew about. They were describing blood clots going from the ankle to the hip. Ankle to the hip. We've never seen this in clinical medicine before. 11% of the cases in the Wu paper are fatal. So none of this is conjecture. We can actually stay within the bounds of the peer-reviewed literature and understand what's going on. But there's a couple of historical points I think American public should be aware of. Carrico and Weizmann just received the Nobel Prize for their modification of this messenger RNA called pseudouridination, replacing one of the natural base pairs, uracil, with pseudouridine. Pfizer and Moderna both decided strategically to, instead of replacing every so many uracils, to actually replace them all. And they took a messenger RNA that would have been broken down pretty quickly and made it essentially indestructible. And so that's what creates the messenger RNA, is read by a ribosome, passed to another one, passed from cell to cell. And again, the disturbing thing is the companies have not told us, when does this ever get out of the body? In order for a drug to be approved, it has to go through standard, what's called pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic testing. All of this was skipped. They never told us, when does the body get rid of this? When does the spike protein shut off? It's a genetic code. Now, the FDA, prior to the pandemic, has rules on genetic therapies. The window of safety concern on a genetic therapy is 5 years. Now, if we give a pill for diabetes, and we're testing this in a clinical trial, and I've done this, I've chaired data safety monitoring boards, made the FDA presentations. After 30 days, we say, listen, it's over with. The pill is out of the body, it's over with. With the conventional vaccines, which I've described for the committee, the window of concern from a regulatory perspective is 2 years. Anything that happens within 2 years, we have to consider the vaccine could have cost it. But a genetic vaccine is 5 years. So my patients are asking me, Dr. McCullough, when is it over with? I took these shots in 2021. I realized they weren't safe. I said, I don't know, but a regulatory perspective would say 5 years of concern.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, gentlemen. We will definitely do another round. This time I'd like to hand it over to Senator Johnson.
Well, first of all, thank you, Congresswoman. This is, I know, not a real popular hearing for you to hold. It's not a real popular thing that these three doctors have been doing over the last 3 years. I've actually got the full list of all of the torment you've gone through, but you've all been investigated, you've all been maligned, you've been vilified, attempts to be decertified, licenses restricted. It hasn't been easy. And what I do want to quick point out is we have three doctors in front of us that all had the courage and compassion to actually treat COVID patients. You know, think back in the early days of COVID, we had no idea how deadly it was. And so it took real courage to be a nurse or a doctor on the front lines and do that. And so we have three doctors who did that. Dr. McCullough, do you remember Dr. Jha? He was the Democrat witness in our November 19th, 2020 hearing on early treatment, who, when I asked the question, have you ever treated a COVID patient? He said no, kind of a mic drop moment. We found out later he never left his apartment until a couple months after the vaccine came out. That's how afraid he was. He is, or was, the COVID czar for the Biden administration. So I know I've veered off course. First of all, let me say the first 45 minutes of this has just been a fabulous primer. And if people watching the video, if you've not watched anything else, watch that first 45 minutes. We've laid the groundwork. The question that's going through my mind, I've got all kinds of medical questions as well, but I want to ask the basic question. With all the peer-reviewed studies, with all the clinical analysis that all of you have seen, it's obvious to you. It's been obvious to me for years. You know, there's a reason. By the way, let's quick put up this chart, if we could. You have it in front of it. This is a chart that I first started developing in June of 2021. I was already watching the VAERS as of March and April. Okay, I remember April when there are a couple thousand deaths showing on the VAERS system. I had Francis Collins in front of me. I said, what, are you looking at this? He admitted the 6 deaths from the Johnson & Johnson, but he said very callously, well, Senator, people die. When he was asking about the other thousands. By the way, back then it was 46% of those deaths were occurring on day 0, 1, or 2. So I've just put this chart together because, obviously our hearings were about early treatment and how supposedly dangerous hydroxychloroquine was, or ivermectin, a horse medicine, right? I put this as a comparison, and you can see the difference. These, by the way, the top lines here are the FAERS, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. It just shows total deaths reported over 27 years for ivermectin, 37 years for hydroxychloroquine, flu vaccines, dexamethasone, Tylenol. And you see that the average deaths per year. Again, everything could potentially be dangerous, but you compare that to the COVID vaccine off of VAERS, we're up to almost 37,000 deaths worldwide. 24.4% of those deaths are occurring on days 0, 1, or 2 following vaccination. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical researcher, but I know VAERS doesn't prove causation, but man, that's a correlation that you ought to be looking at. Okay? By the way, I also just, because one of the pushbacks in this, where we gave billions of doses. So I finally did the calculation in terms of deaths per million dose. So for the COVID vaccine in the US, the deaths per million doses for COVID vaccine is 25.1. On average, it's hard to get this for flu, so we assume 70% of a flu vaccine administered was actually injected. The deaths per million dose for the flu vaccine, assuming 70% are injected, is 0.46. 0.46 versus 21, that's a 55-fold higher death per million rate for the COVID vaccine. So my question, I actually have a question. Why isn't the rest of the medical community acknowledging this? I mean, obviously we've got eminently qualified doctors. I know how you've been vilified, how they've tried to marginalize you, but anybody who's listening to this panel realize these are highly qualified, compassionate doctors. What is happening throughout our medical establishment?
I guess the honest thing to say is I have no idea. We have jumped the rails. We're used to I serve as a pediatrician. When I would give, I was comfortable with treatments if I thought they were effective, with about a 1 in a million for vaccines. A 1 in a million chance of getting it, what you were trying to prevent, a 1 in a million of death. I felt comfortable with that. So when you have something, and we knew very early, the signal was early. It wasn't late for the COVID vaccines. They were very early. Probably within a month, we met criteria that previous vaccines had been taken off the market, whether it was Shield or whether it was swine flu and many others. There are a whole bunch of times we make mistakes in medicine. What the country counted on is that not only the doctors would speak up, but then the regulatory bodies would say, okay, you're right, that met signal, we got to pull it off. I don't know what's going on, because when I look at the Cleveland Clinic data, when there are 51,000 employees that are looked at, and they study and they say, what's your risk of getting COVID? And it looks at how many vaccines you had. The lowest risk for getting COVID is if you've had 0 vaccines. As you add vaccines, your risk to get COVID goes up. I've never seen a vaccine like this. That's not the basis of vaccines. They shouldn't have what we would call negative efficacy. That is a peer-reviewed, beautiful study from Cleveland Clinic, completely ignored. I think that a lot of times, some of our colleagues, what I hear from most of my colleagues, Kirk, you're right, but I'm not going to stick my head out. I'm going to work 1 or 2 more years, and then I'm retiring.
I want to piggyback on Dr. Milhoan's excellent comment. Fear. The simple answer is fear. The body of the profession of medicine is almost all employed now. The number of people that have spoken out have mostly been independent, and those who weren't independent did pay that price, lost their jobs for speaking truth. And are our colleagues awake? Are people getting these boosters? No, they're not, because the people are awake. They're still pretty quiet as well. There's obviously a vocal 30% of Americans that are speaking out. We have a booster for something that's extinct, and it's still being pushed by our government agencies. XBB 1.5 is now 0.0% prevalent. We're at JN1, which is 62% prevalent. We have a booster vaccine from Pfizer for something that doesn't exist, and we still have a government pushing it. But we have physicians and we have healthcare systems that are dependent on the government teat, and they're nursing that teat for every dollar they get. And anybody that speaks against that cash flow gets the hatchet. So why are people not speaking up? I don't know why they forgot the oath that we all took.
Yes.
We took that oath and we paid the price. Would I pay the price over again? You bet we would, because this is about humanity and it's about the long-term health of humanity. And so I encourage my fellow physicians around the world, speak up. Don't be afraid. Even if you're in the truth of one, be that voice of truth. And that's what we're up against, fear. And how do you overcome fear? With courage.
I want to add to that. I think the body of practicing physicians and nurses and medical technologists and all the allied health professionals, the vast majority took the vaccines and were under mandates, under Biden's mandates to take the vaccine. They all have a deep conscious or subconscious fear themselves of what's in their bodies. They likely had their families vaccinated. They likely promoted these vaccines with their patients. Think about how deep this is. This goes back to doctors smoking cigarettes, advertising cigarettes, smoking in the operating room, saying that smoking cigarettes is good for them. It took 40 years before doctors reversed course and capitulated and said, oh, we were wrong on this. And in this horror, as they woke up to recognize this. And The Emperor of All Maladies, written by Mukherjee at the Dana-Farber Institute, he describes the lead lung cancer surgeon for Johns Hopkins. He was smoking as he was removing lung cancers and vehemently denied that smoking caused lung cancers, and he himself died of lung cancer. You know, these are historical types of observations that I think will go down in history. It was an early Texas A&M survey done to show only 4% of doctors didn't take the vaccines. These doctors are at a premium right now because patients want some fair evaluation. As a doctor, I can fairly give somebody an opinion regarding an aortic valve problem because I don't have the problem myself. I can actually be objective. Once doctors have taken the vaccine, they simply can't be objective. And what we're hearing from patients is that they're being ignored, and what's going on is called gaslighting, that they're told that this is in their head because the doctors themselves and the nurses do not want to come to their own personal recognition that they themselves have taken the vaccine. This is a unique problem that is going to bear out over time, and I hope that these individuals, in a sense, become aware. Now, clearly, I have doctor after doctor, nurse after nurse coming to me saying, I've developed myocarditis. I've developed a blood clot. Now I'm regretful. But I'm hoping that they themselves don't have to develop a personal medical problem to become aware and be activated because they have a duty to warn others.
I'll definitely have another round, but I'll yield.
Thank you. Congressman Davidson.
Thank you for organizing this hearing. Thank you for those of you who've really risked your livelihoods and who knows what else to speak the truth. And it's an honor to be able to join you today and try to do something about it. We'll make it more public so people in the future will find primary source documents that speak the truth. And a lot of times I'm left going, well, that might be the only thing Congress can accomplish. It's been hard to pass laws. But one that I'm working on. Look, I was a veteran. In the military, you get shot with all kinds of things. It's an assembly line process, pre-deployment checklists. You're always getting new things. Probably some of them are experimental. So I like that you've pointed out the distinction between mRNA vaccines and other vaccines. And I think people will intentionally blur those lines to try to confuse people on that. And when you think about the military, traditionally, it's a risk assessment. And you're essentially saying, hey, the risk is great enough that, you know, the trade-offs merit whatever course of action you're deciding. So fundamentally, the military is in the risk assessment business. And right away, we knew, and we were briefed from the get-go, that this was a virus, the COVID-19 virus, was something that affected young, fit, healthy people in much less risky ways than people that were older, less healthy, anyone with comorbidities. And the very definition of young, fit, healthy people should be the active duty military force. So nevertheless, the Biden administration mandated that everyone shall take the vaccine. We thinned out our military, critical people that, take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to train, that even if you wanted to find somebody, not everyone can be an Army Ranger, a Navy SEAL, a fighter pilot. And nevertheless, they were expelled. Now the administration is saying, oh, no, come on back, because they've kind of said, wow, we really do have some readiness consequences. But the people who are dealing with the health consequences. So I like that all of you have touched on the consequences of myocarditis. Perhaps that's the most well-documented health case. And we've seen that in the active duty force. One of the amendments that we were able to get in the National Defense Authorization Act was a required study to say, what are the incidences of vaccine injury in the active duty force? Now, I'll admit I'm a little concerned that we're going to get an honest set of data because of some of the things that you guys have shared today. And frankly, the way the administration has politicized everything about COVID. But here's one of the things. We exempted the vaccine makers from liability. All right. We didn't exempt people who mandate the vaccine from liability. So in the private sector, I don't know which trial lawyers are working on lawsuits against all the private employers that mandated vaccines of their own will. But in the federal government, the Department of Defense mandated these things. And when you have injured veterans, because they were directed to do things, the Veterans Administration provides disability compensation and claims. And so I'm working on legislation that would be presumptive if you are an active duty service member who was, or a service member who was directed to take the vaccine, and within 1 year of taking the vaccine, you developed myocarditis. And then other things that they'll go through the rulemaking process to determine, but specifically myocarditis, because the data has been so well established on it, the cause and effect. And that you would be presumptive, just like we did in the burn pit legislation, for example. So I just wonder if you could talk about, the responsible party there, if the government has mandated that, with the knowledge of the risks and the consequences for the veteran. And then how do we take care of not just myocarditis, but building the data set to show the level of injury to these service members?
Thank you, Congressman. As someone who proudly wore the uniform back in the 1980s in the Air Force, and my colleague, Dr. Milhoan, was also former Air Force, so we appreciate the line of questioning because it's near and dear to our hearts, having proudly served this country. And I think it's tragic that we rolled it out on that young, healthy cohort, this experimental investigational product early on. And Senator Johnson brought up early, the Department of Defense has a database. Their epidemiology, medical epidemiology database is the best in the world. And after the hearing we had December or January, year or so ago, they froze that. We had the data at that point. We know who was being injured, and we saw marked rises in all sorts of conditions. And when he tried to request the information from them, they said, oh, we've got to update our database. And then they basically, a glitch, and erased it. So yes, I mean, there should be, 231 uniformed service members, present or previous, just filed for court-martial against Secretary of Defense and others. And I think that's a reasonable action based on forcing our troops into something investigational that hampered the readiness of our nation. I get calls from military physicians around the country every week reporting to me the clotting they're seeing. Lost another pilot today, got another one sidelined, myocarditis. Another 40-year-old had a heart attack. Another 27-year-old had a heart attack. Another 22-year-old has an 18-inch clot. I get calls every week from medical physicians around the country reporting to me what's happening. I appreciate, and not only, I love what you did with the defense authorization, but we should restore their back pay in addition and restore them to full honor and duty if they even want to come back to a government that harmed our own soldiers that were defending our own country. So this is obviously, I'm passionate on this one, obviously. So I will calm my comments and defer to Dr. Milhoan, my other fellow Air Force friend.
As a person who got my second smallpox vaccine before I deployed, and got my entire anthrax series before I deployed twice to Iraq, and was in both of my deployments in Iraq by a burn pit. Thank you for all that you're doing. I think that, I really, as I approach these situations, because I think sometimes my wife talks about this as she writes about these things. She says, I think one of the problems is no one can imagine this amount of evil is going on, that people can hear what the data are showing, and it's still being pushed forward. I think a lot of us liked Hanlon's razor when never attribute to malice what can be easily explained with ignorance. Okay, there's no more ignorance. So I shared with you the Cleveland Clinic data. It doesn't work. So now we have, it doesn't work. It doesn't work to decrease risk of infection. So what are we using it for? Because it has no benefits. So now all we're left with is risk. And when I showed Ed Dowd's data, that's 14 to 15 to 44-year-olds. That's the military member. These are the people we expect the most out of, right? And so we have this blip on this new treatment is causing this, and we've seen the blip. I guess, Mike, I appreciate all you're doing. This is no longer ignorance, they know. And so now what it seems like we have transitioned from ignorance to malice, is that they know this is wrong and they know this is hurting people without any benefit. It must stop.
Absolutely, and amen. Thank you for saying that. And I think in our system, historically, we've had things like that happen, but when it happens, then there's massive liability. And, can anyone speak about that? I mean, I don't know that we'll be able to get large liability out of the government, but we can at least take care of our veterans, as we have in numerous other cases. But what I hope to do is establish the data set so that there can be someone held accountable in the private sector, because as you said so well, Dr. Milhoan, it's not ignorance anymore.
Mr. Davison, I want to point out that we need a pathway. I am caring for numerous people who are service members, military contractors, and it is a complete disorganized mess right now of who orders what test, how are they going to get the care, who's going to cover the next sets of tests, how do they get access to specialists. This is a giant problem. The costs are skyrocketing right now. I've never ordered so many cardiac MRIs and echocardiograms and EKGs and recurrent visits to the emergency room or the clinic for the service members. We need an organized approach to take care of them. We have to recognize the vaccines have injured our servicemen, and we need a program. Right now, they are desperate, and they're going everywhere for care right now because they don't feel like they can get it through the standard medical provisions in the military. Many of them are not service-connected veterans, so they're not going to VAs. Some of them are in and out of service. So we really need the whole bundle, not only what's happened, who's responsible, but how to take care of them.
Thank you. That is the exact purpose of the legislation we're drafting now, and just appreciate your work and look forward to the collaboration to hopefully get this across the finish line. Now yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to yield time to Congressman Biggs. Those are great.
Thank you. Thanks, Representative Greene. And thank you for organizing this. And Senator Johnson, thank you for your leadership and work on this as well. And thank you to each of you for your long time efforts in this area. I wanted to go back and just kind of give a retrospective and then bring it up and ask you to update us. So in March of 2022, you actually had the first tranche of documents come out through FOIA requests about Pfizer's their tests and what they had discovered about their unique vaccine, right? At that time, they found that there were more than 1,000 unique adverse side effects to the mRNA injections. And I wanted to share with you some of the ones that were listed in those documentation And then I want to talk, and you've led us there, and I want to get down to try to resolve this, because I really don't understand why and then you've tried to explain it. It's malice, perhaps it's evil, it can no longer be considered unintentional. But this is what the list includes: acute kidney injury, acute flaccid myelitis, anti-sperm antibody positive, brainstem embolism, brainstem thrombosis, cardiac arrest, cardiac failure, cardiac ventricular thrombosis, cardiogenic shock, central nervous system vasculitis, death neonatal, deep vein thrombosis, encephalitis brainstem, encephalitis hemorrhagic, frontal lobe epilepsy, foaming at mouth, epileptic psychosis, facial paralysis, fetal distress syndrome, gastrointestinal amyloidosis, generalized tonic-clonic seizure. This is really tough for a non-doctor to read here.
You're doing great.
Hashimoto's encephalopathy, hepatic vascular thrombosis, herpes zoster reactivation, immune-medicated hepatitis, interstitial lung disease, jugular vein embolism, juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, liver injury, low birth weight, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, myocarditis, neonatal seizure, pancreatitis, pneumonia, stillbirth, tachycardia, temporal lobe epilepsy, testicular autoimmunity, thrombosic cerebral infarction, type 1 diabetes mellitus, venous thrombosis neonatal, and vertebral artery thrombosis are among 1,246 unique medical conditions arising because of this vaccine. They had attempted to actually close this down so these side effects would not be public for 75 years. What drove it? I mean, because it gets to the culpability, really. What drove this establishment just to basically say, we don't care. We just simply don't care. And is it the drive for money? And what I would just ask is the cause of this that we were so scared, it was so unique. They thought the COVID-19 was so unique that we were going to put anybody at risk. We didn't care as long as we got this vaccine. And Dr. Cole, you mentioned something. I wanted you to expand on this as we discuss why this developed and how we prevent this from happening again. And I wonder if is it the consolidation within the medical care profession where you have independence versus everybody's now coming in as employees of these medical care organizations, the role of government, the fact that there are kickbacks available to government officials. Explain to those who are just bumpkins like myself how we got to this point and how we extract ourselves so we don't ever get there again. Can you?
Well, I always like to joke, what is an elephant? An elephant is a mouse built to government standards. So if we go back historically and look, unfortunately, at a lot of laws that have been passed over time, it builds up this machine that's almost unstoppable. So we look at the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act has some horrific parts of it. Look at the Bayh-Dole Act that allowed universities to make gajillions of dollars off their patents. So we go back and does the government work for the people or does the government work for industry? And so that's the big question. And there's so much lobby money. Yes, the FDA is captured by pharmaceutical companies in terms of how much money, what percentage of their budget they get from pharma for drug approval and fast tracking. If you look at the CDC Foundation, they make billions of dollars off vaccine patents. They hold the patents to 56, 58 vaccines now. If you look at the NIH officials, if they have a patent on a drug that goes to market, they can make $150,000 a year for the rest of their life if they, like several of the individuals at NIH that are on the Moderna patent under Tony Fauci. So there are intertwining corrupted interests, financial interests certainly. And when we as a nation value money over our freedom, and when we value our own self-interest over having a constitution that matters to each and every one of us, and a Bill of Rights that we actually believe in and stand for, again, then we're on the wrong track. So I think it started with bad legislation over time that we can roll back, hopefully. I also think to Dr. Milhoan's point, greed plays a role in our society, unfortunately. And I think certain individuals, and I know Dr. McCullough can address the revolving door of the regulators that go on to the pharmaceutical industries. That's my overview. And the ACA, the Obamacare started consolidating systems. And once you have a master over you, your willingness and ability to speak independently and freely falls under that curtain of fear. And it shouldn't. We used to be the freest nation on earth. We used to not have medical commissions attack people for free speech. We used to actually stand for individual rights and individual principles. But it's been rolled up into these large corporations, machines, captured agencies. And in my opinion, that's why we are where we are now. And that's my opinion. Thank you.
In a book I've published with John Leake, my co-author here today, it's called Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalizations and Deaths While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. We actually describe a complex, a syndicate that's formed, a biopharmaceutical complex, which is powerful. It's been years in formation. But everything we've talked about today, the most interesting thing to me is that it's global. We could be having the same discussion in Germany, in France, in South Africa, in England. None of this is uniquely American. A global syndicate appears to be running the table on this. Now, it includes a lot of powerful non-governmental agencies that are not elected. The United Nations, the WHO, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gavi, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, formed by Gates and WEF, Unitaid, all the regulatory agencies are involved. Dr. Fauci was just here testifying. He is very prominent and active in the WHO. He is in no way retired. Jeremy Farrar, who is at the Wellcome Trust, who is in on these conversations with Fauci and Collins to try to cover up the lab origins of the virus, he's been rewarded for his work. He's now the chief scientist at the WHO. We have about 90% of our FDA commissioners take wonderful, lucrative jobs in industry after they finish regulating those individuals. You saw Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner, now on the board of Pfizer, on CNBC every day. Guess what? Promoting the Pfizer vaccine. Now it's in the open. Now we have FDA Commissioner Califf and one of the division directors, Marks, openly promoting the COVID-19 vaccines off-label. They're promoting the vaccines for things they actually don't do. They're promoting the vaccines to reduce hospitalization and death. Not a single prospective double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial ever showed the vaccines reduced hospitalization and death. There's no valid observational study that shows this. They're promoting the vaccines to prevent long COVID. In fact, they do just the opposite. A paper by DeExner and colleagues shows that actually the vaccines make long COVID way worse. It don't make it better. So they're out there, instead of being objective and being our watchdogs on drug safety, they're out there now, part of this complex, promoting these products. Listen, when you said 75 years, the attorney for the FDA didn't want to release it for 75 years. The FDA is driving this conspiracy to cover up this drug safety problem that we have in the United States. It's a drug safety catastrophe. And the reason why we're here today is because our FDA has gone rogue. They are simply rogue. They are now an extension of this biopharmaceutical industry. They are not protecting Americans from the safety concerns of biologic agents today. And I think that's our greatest concern.
And I'll get to you in a second, Dr. Milhoan. I know I'm probably out of time, but I'll just say the cartelization that you've described is reminiscent of previous cartelizations through history. I mean, if you look into Japan, 1912 to 1926, you're going to see that kind of same cartelization that takes place. And what does that lead to? It leads to loss of liberty, freedom for the nations that are cartelized. And you described a global cartel, basically, a cabal. Dr. Milhoan.
Yeah, I'd like to take it it's a really good question, and I think it's so multifaceted, but I wanted to take it from the physicians, sort of this new corporatization of America. And there's a carrot and a stick. The carrot is if you get enough of your panel vaccinated, you get a bonus. If you don't get the bonus. That's all throughout. When that came out, I'd never heard about that as a pediatrician before. I told people that doesn't occur. There's no way that happens. Pediatricians don't do this. Then I heard that if they had enough, they got a $40,000 bonus. What? And then if you speak out and you don't do it, and you don't know, because of the electronic medical record, they know everything that's going on, and you have the green light or the red light and all these kinds of things. Everyone knows the practice governors know what's going on. And so if there are incentives that are even beyond the doctor to doctor, but into corporate medicine, that's a pretty big carrot. But there's also a stick. Is that if you speak out about this, you venture to say, whenever in medicine was I told what I could say what should be exempted? You can only exempt this vaccine for this. No, I've exempted so many kids for vaccine. Oh, you had a bad reaction to that? Okay, I'm never going to give that to you. This is basic. Never in our history were doctors limited on what we could exempt if we said, this is bad for our patient. You can't say that. And if you say it, you're gone. So that's that. The other part is what you were speaking to, Congressman Davidson, is the issue of when the doctors wake up and they realize the data were there and they caused harm to their patient. There's concern. Am I liable now? Because I ignored the data. And if now I insisted and I told them, and maybe I didn't give them informed consent, maybe I didn't tell them of the specific numbers of myocarditis we know occur. Maybe I forced a person who was completely healthy, who had no risk, to get something that had a true known risk. Maybe some of this is just like, I can't say this vaccine is wrong now because now I have to own all the ones when I said it was right, when the data were there and I ignored it.
Yeah, trust is simple. It's truth plus transparency. And then you earn trust. And we have agencies that aren't transparent and aren't truthful. And it's simple as that. If you want to trust your government, the government needs to be truthful and transparent. And that's what we're lacking from the agencies. That's why it took the judge, overturned the FDA's desire to hide data from us for 75 years. Trust, truth plus transparency. That's simple.
I will tell you what's happening patient to patient to patient to patient. The catastrophic loss of trust in physicians and medicine and pharmaceutical companies is at a place I've never seen it. It's a crisis. Because now I can't even get them to do things that are not risk at all and have great benefits, because they go, well, I don't trust what any doctor says now, and I don't trust what any drug, right? All that's gone. And that's not an easy thing to get back once we've lost it.
Yeah, we're in Congress. Tell us about that. I'll yield to Representative Greene.
Thank you. Boy, we could talk about that on all kinds of levels. Senator Johnson, you had a question pertaining to something Dr. Cole was talking about.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for yielding, because that question leads right into where I was going to go with my next line. Throughout the pandemic, and again, to me, this has been obvious because I've been connected to you guys for 3-4 years now, and I kept racking my brain. Well, how can this keep going? It can't be greed. I mean, we're literally costing economies trillions and trillions of dollars. We were destroying people's lives. This can't be about the greed of 10 or 50 or $100 billion in pharmaceutical profits. I couldn't. You just couldn't square that circle, right? The root cause, I've come to understand is really just the liability protection for vaccines.
Mhm.
If you go back to October 2019, when you had Rick Bright, who is the fellow who issued the emergency use authorization, which sabotaged hydroxychloroquine, he's on the stage at the Milken Institute with Dr. Fauci. And they're bemoaning the fact, I mean, look at this video. It's very instructive and it's key. They're bemoaning the fact that we don't have a universal vaccine program. And the flu just hasn't done it. We haven't been able to convince enough people. And then they comment, it's going to take probably going to take a pandemic. This is a couple of weeks before Event 201. It was largely focused on how to censor misinformation. In other words, the truth. Okay, I mean, they planned the reaction to the response to a pandemic very well. My question, because you had the mRNA patented from Moderna, within a day of learning the genome? There's something unique about it, the mRNA platform within the whole vaccine world that's just way more profitable, right? I mean, ordinary vaccines, you have to grow them in cultures and it just takes a while. You identify a flu vaccine, it's like 6 months to 9 months later on, it's already, that virus is gone. mRNA, you can have that mRNA, the new mRNA vaccine overnight. So I guess I'm wondering what is it about what these people want to do with this mRNA platform? And then I want to go an extension because I need my House colleagues to really pay attention to this over the next couple of months of what is happening now with the WHO amendments that are going to take away our sovereignty, take away a lot of our health freedom, have the Gavis and the World Health Organization, the Faucis and the Bill Gates and all those folks pretty well call the shots during the next pandemic to force mRNA vaccines in everybody's arm if you're going to have a vaccine passport. So again, I'm sorry I've kind of dragged on here, but I mean, this is, as I've been dealing with this now for 3 or 4 years, and I'm trying to get my head around the evil. You don't want to believe that something this evil could be pushed globally. Why?
Senator, let me pick up on the messenger RNA. There's some important citations. A paper in British Medical Journal by Lalani, first author, points out that United States and other major Western countries have had a love affair with messenger RNA since 1985. We have poured tens of billions of dollars into messenger RNA before the pandemic. Before the pandemic. There are over 9,000 messenger RNA patents. 9,000. Most of the prominent people who have a claim to invent messenger RNA are in Europe and they work for these big companies. But let me tell you, the big patent holders are Sanofi, CureVac, Moderna, number 4, the U.S. government. The U.S. government is knee-deep in messenger RNA. In 2012, DARPA, our research unit of the military, declared a program. It's called the ADEPT P3 program. It said we will end pandemics that could affect our military within 60 days using messenger RNA. That's in 2012. Messenger RNA didn't come out of Operation Warp Speed. This has been in the background. Now, the companies, you're right, because you literally on a computer screen can redesign the code and then come up with a novel protein. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could replace a missing protein like insulin in a type 1 diabetic or alpha-galactosidase in a patient with Fabry disease? The companies tried this over time. The messenger RNA technology failed for replacement of normal proteins because the human body figures this out and it has ways of basically just not having this take. Now, when Carrico and Weizmann won the Nobel Prize for this really creation now of synthetic messenger RNA, it was historic that across all Scandinavia, there were candlelight protest vigils about how evil and terrible this technology is. This has never happened before, where a Nobel Prize was awarded and immediately people said, no, this is a global mistake for humanity. This is playing out right in front of us. You know, the Nobel Prize is not always a mark of human beneficence. It's not. In fact, there are multiple Nobels that have led to great disaster. including Nobel himself and dynamite, Dr. Haber and poison gas that was used to gas people to death in Nazi Germany, the invention of the temporal lobotomy, which was done for about a decade and a half in the United States. It turned patients with schizophrenia into vegetables. It was a total disaster. That was Manitz. So listen, the Nobel Prize can be something that's horrible for humanity. Messenger RNA was recognized as something horrible for humanity, and it's being protested real time. Moderna's announced 40 different messenger RNA vaccines. They've already tested a influenza vaccine. They have an Epstein-Barr virus vaccine that they halted because of myocarditis. And when I pointed out the Crossan paper, which finds the messenger RNA in the human heart, to me, that was a seminal paper. This is Harvard Department of Pathology, because if COVID-19 messenger RNA gets stuck in the human heart and causes inflammation and damage there by producing protein, all messenger RNA vaccines will do that, all of them. And I agree with Dr. Cole, as well as Dr. Milhoan. One of the things that should come out of this is a strong call to suspend all messenger RNA development because of this concern on human safety. This is to have, poised influenza vaccines and childhood vaccines using this genetic technology, in my view, is going to be a disaster for the American population.
Again, my summation here is I'm asking my House colleagues, because the Democrats in the Senate won't touch this 10-foot pole. Now, I offered an amendment to deem any agreement with the WHO a treaty. Every Republican voted for it except for one. Every Democrat voted against it. So we need the House to step up the plate, understand what is happening right now in terms of the Biden administration negotiating, with all these other countries in the world, amendments to the WHO agreement that could take away our sovereignty, and we need to stop it. And we need to expose it so that we can stop it.
100%. And the WHO, we need to withdraw from the WHO. And the WHO is primarily private funded by all those organizations Dr. McCullough mentioned.
Yeah, I can assure you, you're looking at lawmakers up here that definitely want to defund the WHO and the UN. I don't think we should be participating. You guys agree with that? I think we're on board. Senator Johnson, I assure you we are totally on board and in agreement with you.
Can I just make a mention of this? I think that our body is fearfully and wonderfully made. And when you decide to tinker with this beautifully designed body, for instance, what Dr. McCullough brought up, the heart cell is really meant to do one thing, and that is to beat. And so it has all the proteins it needs to beat. When you ask that heart cell to do something else than just beat, you're going to have problems. This platform goes everywhere. So the way the beautiful body was designed, we're now tinkering with this beautifully balanced creation. And I really believe that mRNA technology is really playing God. And that usually ends up in a very bad situation.
I fully agree with you. Speaking of playing God, I got to listen to Dr. Fauci earlier this week. And yeah, well said. I want to bring up before the hearing today, just some of what he talked about in the deposition we had with him. He wrote a paper back in 2012 where he described a scenario, and he was talking about gain of function, changing, and I'm not a doctor, so if I screw this up, but we're changing viruses, and he wanted to get ahead of nature. That's what he was talking about, getting ahead of nature, because he was saying that nature creates viruses, and we have to get ahead of nature, and we have to create vaccines to fight the viruses that nature creates. Speaking of playing God. And gain of function, he was talking about gain of function research allows these scientists to be able to do that. Therefore, it's so necessary and important with the gain of function to create these viruses in a lab and then work on vaccines to combat the viruses. But then in this paper, he described a scenario where, worst case scenario, the virus escapes the lab and our worst nightmares come true. He also states in this paper that the benefits outweigh the risk. Those are Dr. Fauci's words. The benefits outweigh the risk. And this was back in 2012, and we saw the exact description of what he was talking about literally come true, happened to all of us and happened to the entire world. And in the questioning earlier this week with Dr. Fauci, he was asked if there's anything that you could do or change, or what would you like to, anything to make all of this better. He said the one thing he would like to do he wanted to see a stronger WHO, or stronger UN, stronger world governing body over these labs to make sure that they're all compliant and make sure that they're all operating under the same rule. And then Dr. McCullough, you just mentioned that Dr. Fauci is working and serving with the WHO. Well, no wonder. This is a man, I want you all to really think about this. This is a man who for years and years and years, with his government position and government funded paycheck, was allowed to play God basically unchecked. And now it's no wonder that he wants to see a stronger WHO and a world governing body that would force medical compliance on all of Americans. So, Senator Johnson, I totally agree with what you said. This is something that we have to get ahead of. We have to get ahead of it, and we as lawmakers owe the American people that. I want to pivot to a question. And it's something that I've seen on the internet, and all conspiracy theories are all over the internet. So I don't know if this is a conspiracy theory or not, but I want to ask this question. Serving on the committee, we've talked a lot about origins for COVID-19. That's been primarily the focus of our COVID committee so far. Now, I'm just asking this question because this is something I've heard. Could COVID-19, it was created in a lab, could it have been created to target races? Say, for example, if China wanted to put a bioweapon on India and they wanted to defeat India with a virus, can they make bioweapons, make viruses to target human beings based on something in our DNA, something in our genetics, say like our race or being one group of people? Is that possible, or is that strictly?
Technically, it's possible. And if you look at the affinity of the binding of the spike protein to the ACE2 receptors, there's a mutation called the K26R mutation. And if you have that K26R mutation, spike doesn't bind. And that happens to be a couple of ethnic groups. And then if you go through, the Scandinavians, it binds more strongly. And then, blacks, and that binds less affinity in certain Asian populations. So the spike protein does target a binding of more strength with different genetic profiles. However, the spike protein also binds to a lot of cell surface proteins and can enter the cell through a lot of other pathways. Is that biologically feasible to do that? Well, ask Metabiota and other laboratories that were in the Ukraine. What were they tinkering with? This is the problem with bioweapons programs. And you go back to, Lyme disease research and development back in, anyway, long history of bioweapons research.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible genetically to do? Yes, it is. Is it probable in this scenario? Only if you ignore all the other receptors that the spike protein binds to. So I think it's partially scientifically backed, but conspiratorial in the sense that this is a multifaceted protein that attacks our cells in multiple ways.
There's a paper published by Farkas and colleagues in the journal Military Medicine, and it analyzed SARS-CoV-2 according to the criteria of a bioweapon. And there are dozens of criteria, and they check the box on, does the virus have these capabilities? The answer from the Farkas analysis, SARS-CoV-2 is a bioweapon. Now, there are two papers in the preprint literature by Dr. Xin Ling, who also a Chinese investigator now in the United States, who's also concluded it's a bioweapon. We don't hear about military defense systems and weaponry anymore. We hear about biological threats and countermeasures. So the biological threats are the viruses, the bacteria and fungi that are being developed in these biological laboratories. And the countermeasures are vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and other therapeutics. What we've learned is this is big business. This is big government business. Companies get very rich contracts. They get pre-purchased products, huge amount of. We've seen this with SARS-CoV-2. We've seen it with monkeypox. We are now seeing this now. This is big, big business. And what's happened is that companies have rushed in. There's so much money there that no one can step back and say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Gain of function is to modify an organism to become more infectious and more lethal. In the papers published by Menacherry as first author, Ralph Barrett as senior author, Nature Medicine in 2015, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. These are widely read and cited papers. They describe the creation of a Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 SARS-like virus. In the papers, they thank the National Institutes of Health and NIA, Dr. Fauci, for supporting the research. They thank Dr. Peter Daszak for taking these plans and shuttling them over to China. They thank Dr. Xingling Li in China for doing the work. They say in the papers it's gain of function research, but because it started before the ban on federal funding for gain of function research, they say it's exempt, and now it's being done in China. They describe the creation of a virus that looks like it's prototypical SARS-CoV-2 in the lab. This is published 2015, 2016. It means the work was done back in 2012, 2013. They never released the genetic code for what they produced to ClinGen, the Bank for Genetic Code, which they're supposed to. And Barrick says publicly, well, we discussed it with the NIH and we thought it's better that we not to do this. This is the question. The COVID Select Committee should be all over these Barrick papers and say, where's the code for this? Odds are it may match very closely, if not perfectly, the original strain that came out of the lab. This would be proof positive that this was a U.S. joint program of gain of function research. It's all chronicled because when Fauci is going over the emails with Collins and Jeremy Farrar and Christian Anderson from Scripps and Eddie Holmes from University of Sydney, they say, oh boy, how are we going to deal with these papers? And the decision by Fauci was to commission Christian Anderson to write the first deceptive paper on the natural origins of SARS-CoV-2. In January, they all thought it came out of the lab and it was Barrick's virus that came out of the lab. But by April, Christian Anderson publishes in Nature Medicine, it must have come out of a Chinese fish market, a wet market. And 12 more papers were published by Anderson, Holmes, and others. This was the great academic deception. That was the storyline they created. This is what I would expect as a U.S. citizen, the House Select Committee to be on, laser focused on this. Not asking Fauci about 6-foot distancing. That's wasting Americans' time, quite honestly. We want to see some hard questions. Ralph Barrett, who's been publishing on coronaviruses at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, since the 1990s, should be on Capitol Hill every week being questioned. Peter Daszak at Ethiopia Health Alliance, which is a richly funded NGO with dozens and dozens of employees, has publicly said that he wants to create a library of these coronaviruses and a library of vaccines. He wants to hold the power. It's his public aspiration. It's on his website. We ought to be checking out Peter Daszak pretty hard. You know, he just got another round of funding. Now, he's not going directly to Wuhan. He's taken his federal dollars to Duke University in Singapore to guess what? To work on more coronaviruses. Now, Fauci, Tedros at the WHO, Peter Hotez, a vaccine frontman down in Houston, Bill Gates, they all say there's going to be another pandemic. They all say this with great enthusiasm. They say it's going to be way worse than COVID. These are their public statements. I think we should take them seriously. There are way too many gain of function pathogens being created in these labs right now. And all we need is a breakdown, whether it's intentional or unintentional, and another release, and the whole world could get sick again.
Well, I will tell you, to the credit for the COVID Select Committee, they have been focused on just what you're talking about. So I can't let that go by, and I have to give them credit for that. But I hear from so many Americans that want to talk about the vaccines that has been forced on them. I want to bring up one more issue, and then I'll yield to Congressman Davidson. Let's talk about something that people have a lot of fear about, and that's cancer. And I think it was just reported in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago, talking about young people are now having high rates of cancer, higher rates than normal. And then we know that in March of 2023, Pfizer bought a company called Seagen for $43 billion. Seagen's a biotech company that discovers, develops, and commercializes transformative cancer medicines. Again, this is something that I can't say it's related or not related, but the timing is interesting. I just want to ask the three of you, have the COVID vaccines resulted in an increase in cancers, and are turbo cancers real? Is this something that's made up in people's minds, or are you actually seeing it?
I will take the heat for this one because I was the first pathologist in the world to bring up this point. After these shots rolled out, I started seeing an increase in the laboratory of certain types of cancer. You know, I at that point misstated the percentage, and then it normalized, but it was still 2 to 3-fold above what I was seeing in certain types of cancer: endometrial cancers, melanomas in young patients, very aggressive melanomas in young patients, confirmed by my colleague Dr. Anglish de Gleish, one of the leading cancer researchers in the UK, confirmed by oncologists all around the world. There's a paper that came out from Singapore from a pharmaceutical individual. Every cancer drug off patent, look at this, the dose sales percentage increase in Singapore, where you can get the base level data. All of them are up anywhere from 20 to 30%, and this is purchase per dose. And they were one of the most highly boosted nations in the world. If you look at Ed Dowd's data, if you go to financetechnologies.com, he has the data set from the UK. Again, that healthy age 15 to 44 age group. 10 years of data, and then in 2021, huge spike. In 2022, even a bigger spike. The data don't lie. If you look at even the CDC Wonder data, and again, getting the actual base level data out of our government is difficult. I want to congratulate the Informed Consent Action Network and Judicial Watch and others that continue to FOIA our government for information. And I know Senator Johnson has done yeoman's work trying to get information out of these agencies. But even in CDC Wonder data, if you look at every age decile, 15 to 25, 25 to 35, et cetera, there is a hockey stick inflection upward right now in all those data sets. Now, do I want to panic everyone? No. Do we know mechanisms why the shot would do that? Sure. The spike protein binds to the guardian of our genome, the p53 gene. The spike protein binds to the breast cancer and ovarian cancer BRCA gene. And the one thing we didn't bring up today that I know Dr. Malone brought up, every vial that's been examined of this mRNA product is contaminated with DNA from E. coli bacteria. These are all contaminated products. This isn't synthetic mRNA. This is mRNA plus contaminated DNA because they grew these in bacterial cultures of E. coli. Now, what other lengths of segments are going to show up in these vials and shots that could bind upstream or downstream of a cancer-regulating gene in any cell in your body? We don't know. Are there things we can do in the laboratory to look for that? Yeah, there are some tests that could be developed if the NIH cared to do that. But the problem is this contamination could be leading to these problems. Are the turbo cancers real? Well, go try to get an appointment in an oncologist's office right now. You're 3 to 4 months out in most cancer offices to try to get in for an appointment. And do I mean to panic everyone? No. But did we not only, and then if you look at Pfizer and Comirnaty and Moderna, they clearly state, well, mRNA isn't expected to have any genotoxicity, so we're not going to do any mutation or cancer studies on these products because it's mRNA. No, it's not. Every single one from every laboratory around the world that's done this so far, looking at these vials, have had contaminating DNA. Integrated DNA has a much higher cancer risk than synthetic mRNA itself. So, I mean, I have a whole slide on all the mechanisms of injury that these can cause in terms of promoting cancer. every country I've been to, and I was in 3 parliaments before the end of the year, or in Europe, Croatia, Romania, UK. I've been testifying all around the world, everywhere I go. Oncologists, physicians, family members, they all know of someone that after that second or third shot, boom, skyrocketing. And there are some data sets, ask our government why they're hiding theirs, but there are some data sets where it's pretty clear, and especially in the German insurance data sets, you can see the 36% increase in cancer pediatrically after the rollout of the shots. If you look at the UK disability data sets from Ed Dowd, in 2020, there's about a 1% increase. By 21, about 6-7%. By 2022, there was a 35% increase in disability claims for cancer in the UK, and about a 95% shot uptake in the UK. So correlation is not causation. I understand that, but the signals are there. Thank you.
Our CDC should immediately be ordered to match the vaccine administration data to our cancer registry data.
100%.
Listen, these are publicly owned data. CDC is not a private agency. They can't hide Americans' data from it. This is a potential emerging national emergency. To summarize, our agencies and the data are clear that the vaccines cause cardiovascular side effects, neurologic, thrombotic, blood clots, and immunologic. There's safety warnings on that. That's unambiguous. All worldwide agencies agree. The fifth area of concern that we've moved into is cancer. Now, I anticipate Dr. Fauci didn't cite a single paper. And all you've heard me today is pinpoint cite papers. 1984, Sutherland and Baylor published a critical paper. It's called the multi-hit hypothesis of cancer. Meaning, if something causes cancer, chances are it works by different mechanisms. If a drug, for instance, or an exposure, a cancer, it works by multiple mechanisms. Now a paper's been published, fully peer-reviewed. Anguis and Bastillo are the 2 authors. It's called the multi-hit hypothesis of COVID-19 vaccination. How does it work? The Chinese have published that messenger RNA itself does somewhat impair our ability to repair our own DNA if we actually have a breakage in our DNA. As Dr. Cole has pointed out, the spike protein produced in unlimited quantities in a paper from University of Pittsburgh by Singh and Singh shows that it impairs our cancer surveillance systems, P53. The other one's called BRCA or BRCA, that governs female breast and reproductive cancers. The third mechanism is what Dr. Cole points out, is that all the labs that have actually examined the vials show these process-related DNA impurities. Now, when the genetic code for the messenger RNA is installed in an E. coli, which Pfizer and Moderna are using, by the way, the genetic code has to ramp up the production of a piece of circular DNA called a plasmid. They use a complex called SV40, simian virus 40 complex. There's a promoter, an enhancer, and what's called an origin of insertion. These fragments make it crank up, and they actually have to produce an additional fragment called an antibiotic resistant fragment because they're going to kill off the E. coli that don't have the code. So that's how it survives. So they harvest this. So far, all the labs have found either the quantity of these DNA fragments, including SV40, is too high, or the length of the fragments are too high. This has become such a concern that Florida Surgeon General Joe Ladapo has said, listen, this is the final straw, that you can't, the FDA has not done its own inspection of the vials for this reason. The FDA in 2022, recently some documents came forward where there were some inspections of the vials, but it was only for visible impurities, kind of crud in the vials, not actually for these DNA contaminants. I told you the regulatory window of concern for a genetic product is 5 years. That happens to be the window of concern for a cancer. My hunch as a clinician is that if there's a cancer risk with these vaccines, it's cumulative. People, 1 or 2 doses, probably little risk. 4, 5, 6 doses, 10 doses, more. That's kind of how cancer works. The first paper published of someone who took a vaccine and developed a fatal cancer where we think the vaccine caused it was published by Karagoklis and colleagues from Greece. I know, I'm a senior author. It's a man, a little younger than me, takes the cancer and it develops a lesion on the side of his head. and it's considered what's called a basaloid cancer. It rapidly invades and causes Bell palsy, knocks out the facial nerve, then it knocks out the trigeminal nerves, and it invades the brain and kills them. And the conclusion is pathologically that this is the first reported case. I mentioned 3,400 papers on vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths in the peer-reviewed literature. Let me tell you what, that is a gross underestimate, and I'll tell you the reason why. To publish an academic manuscript, doctors are typically at universities. The vast majority of doctors at universities took the vaccines. The vast majority of universities worldwide mandated the vaccines. The publication policies at these universities require university approval of the manuscript before it goes out. Do you think that doctors at an oncology department at Harvard or MD Anderson declaring that the vaccines cause cancer would ever get out the door? When the doctors took the shots, the institutions mandated the vaccines. These manuscripts are dead on arrival. We have seen since COVID a record number of retractions of vaccines. So even if they make it into peer-reviewed literature, and this has happened to me twice, valid papers that are published, contracted, copyrighted, and everything, the publishers and the editors pull these back after they're actually already published. There's guidelines for when a paper has to be retracted. They're called the COPE guidelines. These aren't within the COPE guidelines to pull back a paper. So we see bias, an intentional bias to understate the problem with the vaccines. And I think it's particularly important as we interpret the cancer data. Because the cancer data, we are largely reliant on the big universities here. The independent doctors can't carry this. And if there's a cancer risk emerging, we're not going to see it, unfortunately, until it's way too late.
And this is a real quick point I want to piggyback on. Every attorney general in every state, their job is to protect consumer product safety. These are contaminated products. If a baby formula or a baby bottle of vegetables had glass shards in it or metal shavings in it or a chemical from agriculture, those would be pulled immediately. And yet we still have vials sitting on the shelves of pharmacies all around the nation and the world that are contaminated, not listed as one of the, and here's the problem. You know, the FDA allows for 10 nanograms of DNA in other products. These are wrapped in that little protective fat. They're like, oh, 10 nanograms, whatever. These are protected. They can go everywhere just like the mRNA can. And so every attorney general in this nation, if they have 1 ounce of honesty, 1 iota of responsibility to their citizens, should impound whatever is on the shelf of a pharmacy, send it to independent laboratories, have it tested, and they should be removed from the market post haste.
Yes.
People are pretty good when something changes in their life. They don't have to be a scientist. They don't have to go to medical school. When you hear something happening more this year than it did last year, you understand something changed. What you bring up is people have noticed something changed because they know, I've never heard of so many people who were in complete remission and now they suddenly appear back at their doctor in stage 4. Wait a minute, you've been in remission for 10 years and suddenly you're in stage 4. This is a repeating story that all the non-clinicians hear. I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I don't do the cancers, but I'm hearing these things. And this is what I'll hear from the doctors. I can't believe how many of these cancers I'm seeing, but it couldn't be from the vaccine. It's the only thing that's changed. Okay? So some of what we're fighting with in some of this is, you hear us, we're asking for the data. We're not just trying to make things without claims. We have enough of a signal. We want the whole data set because these questions can be answered. They could be answered right now, but we have to have the data set. We're not afraid to look at the data. If we're wrong, we'll say, wow, we thought this, we were wrong. We're scientists. We really don't, we're just seeking truth. But what we need are the data. And that's what we're asking for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you guys, I know you guys are fighting for this, but this is what we need because this question could be answered basically in a week and we would know, but then there would be, once again, no excuse for taking this off the market.
Mm-hmm. You just got me going as a mom when you said pediatric cardiologist. Dr. Milhoan, are you seeing myocarditis in children, babies? Like, is this something that's actually happening with children receiving the COVID-19 vaccines?
Yeah, so I'll tell you sort of the first case I saw. I was called down to the ER to see this kid because he had a slow heart rate, and he was this incredibly muscular, studly Texas player or Texas football player. And I walk in there, and often what happens when a pediatric cardiologist walks into the ER is everybody leaves the room. Oh, good, cardiology's here. They just all leave, right? But I walk in, and this kid's got a heart rate of 25. I'm thinking, I wouldn't have left the room. Yeah. Story was, second vaccine, next day at sports, he's not feeling so good. They take him in, they hook him up. He's got a heart rate of 20. He had really no risk from COVID at all. Most of these kids, most of these healthy kids, most of them never even knew they had COVID. When we were rolling this out, the CDC believed that 85% of children had already had COVID. We know natural immunity is very profound, if preventing COVID, but also keeping the symptoms very low if you get a new variant. But we see it. I will tell you some of the good news is even though the regulatory bodies have not told the parents know. And so the parents who are willing to go down this road are decreasing. The mandates have come off. So as that has happened, I've watched the acute cases of myocarditis drop off. Now what we're left with are those kids that, and it's hard to tell because it's hard for us to get the data. The data's out there. We'd love to be able to see it. But the study that came out of Thailand that was really concerning to us is when they prospectively looked at this, which is what the drug company should do before they even release a product, and they should continue to be surveilling what has happened, which they promised to do, which was required under a EUA, but they did not. And if they did, they never would let that data out. But they showed that they had a 2%, 2 out of 100 kids, these healthy kids had myocardial damage. When you look at those kids who've had myocardial damage and you look at them 90 days with a cardiac MRI, 50% of them don't return to normal. When your EKG, your echocardiogram, your stress test, your troponins, everything is normal. Everything we would do in an office. A lot of times the only way we do this is with a very expensive test called a cardiac MRI with late gadolinium enhancement. Insurance companies don't want to pay for it. Cardiologists are afraid to order these tests because if they give it as a rationale, this might be a vaccine injury, that might get them in trouble.
Yeah, just to pick up on this, so the Mansugian paper from Thailand, and then another paper by Buren from Basel, Switzerland showed when they do the baseline blood tests and are ready to do EKGs, ultrasounds, and MRIs at baseline, and then follow up at least once or twice in follow-up. So that's a prospective cohort. That's what the FDA in the biological licensing letters to Pfizer Moderna said, you must do this to get fully FDA approved.
Mm-hmm.
Pfizer Moderna never did this. But when these independent studies were done, on shot number 2, which was the Thailand study in children aged 13 to 18, the rate was exactly what Dr. Milhoan said. It was 2.3%. In the Buren study, which was shot number 3, largely in nurses and healthcare workers, the answer was 2.8%. So average those out, it's about 2.5% heart damage risk per shot. Now, only half of them feel it. The other half don't feel it. So what I'm telling you is in a large, when you apply this to billions of people, the data as we sit here today is probably about 1.5% of people have suffered heart damage and they don't know it. I can tell you as a cardiologist,
Is that normal? Like the media is going to say, oh, but this has always been the case. Myocarditis has bin normal.
No, myocarditis in a paper from Finland in 2018 published in Circulation by Arolio and colleagues established this, that we're talking about in the United States. There are numbers of cases per million. We are talking about a couple hundred cases in the United States per year. Giant cell myocarditis, Coxsackie adenovirus. I'm telling you, peer-reviewed literature now. We have tens of thousands of cases. This is not like, and COVID itself does not cause myocarditis. This has been one of the biggest false narratives
Thank
that
you.
have exist. So let me just be clear. 2.5% risk per shot. Half of them have no symptoms. That's now in the peer-reviewed medical literature. The concern is if there's a little bit of scarring that occurs, it can be the site of an abnormal heart rhythm that can suddenly land a young person in cardiac arrest on the playing field or at sleep. And a paper by Catagiani and colleagues from Brazil hypothesized that it's the surge of adrenaline that occurs during sports or during the waking hours of sleep, 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., that triggers these cardiac arrests. And that's exactly what we've seen. Paper by Gill and colleagues from Connecticut. 2 boys, age 16 and 17, take Fizer. On days of 3 and 4 after the vaccine, the parents find them in bed. No chance for CPR. The parents are outraged. They call in the coroner. They do an autopsy. They bring in University of Michigan, University of Minnesota. They conclude it's Fizer vaccine myocarditis that's fatal. One case of this, the FDA should have pulled this off the market. You can imagine parents now having their children die in bed. We've actually had a member of U.S. Congress where this has happened. Okay, this is very, very sad. People not coming to the realization and helping to warn others. This is what we know about COVID, the infection. In 2020, there was a giant search for COVID, SARS-CoV-2 infection and myocarditis. Why? Because Ralph Baric published in 1990s that if we flooded an animal heart with enough human beta coronavirus, we could cause myocarditis. It was published in the journal that was edited in my office, the American Journal of Cardiology, of which I held a very senior position. So I'm very familiar with this. So because of this, the Israeli military, the U.S. military, the college sports teams, so the NCAA Big Ten had the most formal evaluation. They studied all the athletes who got COVID. And in 2020, 30% of the athletes got COVID. Okay, they did everything, cardiac troponin, blood test, EKGs, echograms, MRIs. They came up with about 36 cases, putative cases of myocarditis, where something was a little off in tens of thousands of athletes. Not a single serious case, no hospitalizations, no deaths.
So they weren't dropping dead before the vaccine at a higher rate.
Right. Okay. So then Valley from Israel studies this and said, listen, before the vaccine, there's no higher rate of myocarditis compared to the background rate. Singer and colleagues tries to characterize these cases, no hospitalizations and deaths. So we have 3 papers. What happens? Patients sick with COVID in the hospital, we routinely get cardiac troponin laboratories, as we did with urosepsis, pneumococcal sepsis, what have you. And sure enough, about 20 to 30% are ambiently positive in the critically sick ICU patients. None of these are adjudicated for myocarditis. None have MRIs. And so these sloppy papers come out and say COVID causes high rates of myocarditis. The CDC takes off on this and says, oh, there's a much higher risk of myocarditis with COVID than the vaccine, so therefore we should take the vaccine and cause more myocarditis. And the FDA chairman says this. He's a cardiologist, Rob Califf. This is the type of absolutely ridiculous thinking that goes on right now. I can tell you as a cardiologist, I've looked at the literature, I've contributed to the literature. COVID-19 illness does not cause significant myocarditis. There are troponin elevations in the hospital in sick patients, which are not myocarditis. They're not adjudicated as myocarditis. COVID-19 vaccine is the major cause of myocarditis we're seeing today.
So, beautiful study out of the Nordic countries in JAMA Cardiology, Krasilek, and what he showed is they looked at all the cases. They had 23 million cases to look at in terms of people who've been vaccinated or not, and then they looked at all their risk of myocarditis. You know what they used as the control group? The unvaccinated, because they had the lowest amount of any myocarditis. As you increased doses of vaccine, you increase your risk of getting myocarditis. That should settle this whole thing that I'm going to get the vaccine so I don't get myocarditis. The paper that the one we have problems with is it's from the CDC data set that looked at those who had been diagnosed with vaccine myocarditis at 90 days. And they did all the studies. EKG, echocardiogram, all those by 90 days, you were usually down to normal. That's what I can do in my office very easily. But the one that Dr. McCullough was bringing up is that 50% had abnormal cardiac MRIs. I cannot assess your child's risk for sports participation if they've had symptoms of myocarditis following the vaccine without a cardiac MRI. I just can't do it because all the other tests I would normally use to reassure myself, including stress test, are shown to be normal. So that's this potential silent killer that's out there, but no one really wants to look into it because it's thousands of dollars to get a cardiac MRI.
One important paper has to be cited here. There are cardiac arrests with normal cardiac MRIs now. This is very important. A paper published by Nakahara and colleagues.
Yeah.
University of Texas at Houston, Jagat Narula is one of the prominent authors, very prominent cardiologist in the United States. Hundreds of patients who took the vaccine versus hundreds of patients who didn't take the vaccine. They all get cardiac PET scanning, not MRI, PET scanning. This is very important. A PET scan looks at the metabolic activity of the heart. And they captured people early after the vaccine to 6 months after the vaccine. The findings were 100% of people who took the vaccine, the cardiac PET scans turned abnormal. That instead of the heart using free fatty acids as its energetic fuel, it shifted to a preference in using glucose. And this was a distinctly abnormal pattern. As a cardiologist, I use cardiac PET to see if there's a lack of blood flow to an area, what's called ischemia. And that typically shows the heart muscle changes and actually prefers glucose. That's called a PET abnormality, an ischemic abnormality. What I'm telling you is people who take the vaccine to varying degrees, the hearts are not normal and we can't completely characterize it. Now, importantly, in this Nakahara paper, those who had a sore arm had much more profound abnormalities in the heart. And there's a paper from Germany by Schwab and colleagues, pathologically, that found arm inflammation and heart inflammation. Wow. So what I'm telling you is it's important to understand, were there any initial side effects in the arm? Two papers relate it, but as a cardiologist, I'm very worried. The next cardiac arrest that occurs right now in a previously healthy person, particularly an athlete who's been heavily screened for all the congenital abnormalities, it's my conclusion based on the data that it's due to the vaccine if they've taken a vaccine, unless proven otherwise.
Wow, thank you for that. Congressman Davidson.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate you and your work. And, just pick up on, some of the comments, Dr. McCullough, I think you mentioned about the FDA and the problems with it. And I always think about really one of the, to me, great Americans, great president was Dwight Eisenhower. His farewell address, he cautioned against two things. The one that is widely remembered is the military-industrial complex, but the other one is the scientific technical elite. And perhaps no one illustrates that more than Fauci, the NIH, the CDC, and the FDA. And when you talk about the global nature of this, phenomenon, people were surprised by how quickly the mindset shifted and how globally it shifted. And I go back to the kind of root of that, the institutions that were built, particularly in the post-World War II era, were designed to be those kinds of institutions. And, everyone's familiar with FDA, but let me say what those letters represent: the Food and Drug Administration. You mentioned the desire to have a universal delivery mechanism with a vaccine. Well, the one thing for sure is everybody eats something, and in particular meat. So there's this fascination with some of these folks about trying to create synthetic meat, all kinds of other things. But the things that people give to livestock have caused some concern. And I guess I wonder, as a delivery vehicle for good or bad, what is the Food and Drug Administration doing that we should be paying attention to?
I think this is where a ban on all mRNA technology needs to happen now, not only for humans, but for animals. This is a synthetic mRNA with the pseudo-uridination that Dr. McCullough mentioned. It's hard to break down. Did the mRNA show up in breast milk in a JAMA pediatric study 48 hours later? You bet it did. Does the mRNA show up in every organ in the body? You bet it does. What about undercooked meat and a very difficult to break down synthetic mRNA in the meat you may be eating? They've been doing this in pigs for several years now under kind of a pseudo under the radar program the FDA has, I guess, sidelighted. So for certain bacteria in pigs, it's already happening. And, you know, I don't know, China owns 80-90% of the pork industry in the world, so you might want to ask them about that, not me. But yeah, showing up in the food, again, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, blah, blah, blah. You know the quote. You can't find what you don't look for, plain and simple. And so the easiest way, and the hubris of much of science and the lack of humility in science, is saying ex cathedra pronouncements, we declare this is safe and effective without doing the studies. So going to your question about future vaccination and, you know, getting through the food supply and whatnot, sure, safe and effective if you never look. But if you start looking, and that's why they cut a bunch of us off that are trying to look and research, you have to look for it. Is it in the meat? Is it in the products? Are your regulatory agencies actually looking for what they should be looking for? Or are they just telling you through their hubris and lack of humility that because we say so, and, you know, certain of these individuals make Mangala look like an amateur? I think we need to look before we push anything out on the market. If we value life, if we value the next generation, if we value our children, if we value freedom, then we need to do the proper science to make sure we're doing the proper things for the citizens of this great nation and the world.
You know, we're not good creators. The best scientists, whatever we're trying to make, right? The best pharmaceutical, whatever, artificial hip, artificial heart. Can't make an artificial kidney, you know, it's a big box that has to go on, right? We're not good at this. And as we try, we make an enormous amount of mistakes. And this is with great computer modeling, with theoretical, we're going to have the perfect DNA sequence. We're going to have the perfect mRNA sequence. What I would remind us is that all these things that we're talking about, the answer is usually possibly unknown because we haven't evaluated it. But let's remember that in science, there are an enormous amount of unintended consequences. So we haven't even perceived, because we're tinkering in this way, changing the cells of animals that we eat. What are the unintended consequences of our manipulation of what we previously didn't manipulate?
This conversation reminds me of the movie a lot of people just watched, Oppenheimer, about the angst that Oppenheimer had about he knew what a dangerous technology nuclear weaponry would be. What you're hearing from us today is we acknowledge this brand new era of genetic technology, how potentially dangerous it is. And we've uncovered a critical flaw in our government oversight over this. The FDA has insufficient oversight. The FDA reports to HHS. Okay, there is, from the House side, you have the House Science and Technology Committee and its subcommittee. You got House Government Operations, House Agriculture, House Appropriations, House Committee on Energy Commerce, loose connections through their subcommittees to the FDA. HHS is, you've got a Secretary of HHS cabinet. We have almost no control over the FDA. The same is true for the USDA. Now, if you go on the USDA website, you'll see genetic project after genetic project. And as Dr. Cole pointed out, DNA and RNA vaccines have been in pork now since 2017, self-replicating RNA and DNA vaccines. Now, the animals don't live long enough potentially for us to see these complications, blood clots, myocarditis, et cetera. We can only hope and pray that during the cooking and curing process that the genetic material is destroyed. But beef and fish and in vegetables now, there's a whole array of cooking techniques, and we can't possibly understand if this is going to actually get in humans. Now, a small Chinese company published in December of 2022, Zhang is the first author, that they were able to make a small piece of messenger RNA, actually that's related to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and get it in a milk bubble and administer milk to animals and get the messenger RNA across the mammalian GI tract. And there's been several examples where they're able to get genetic material through watermelon juice and other types of things into the human system. So we need an immediate food safety supply task force here to assess. The USDA is letting us down. Again, these companies are running the table on this. There are naturopathic veterinarians that tell me that with modern farming techniques and the cleanliness, we don't need any vaccines. Now, they've been using traditional for bovine. They have their standard pack, what's called a clostridial pack, and a reproductive pack. So they've got these series of vaccines they give the cattle. But I can tell you right now, we need experts on Capitol Hill to raise the issue about safety in our food supply. Many in the room here, Dr. Stillwagon, I'd like to recognize, has put in important scholarship on this. Personally, I'm concerned. I think it's almost like Oppenheimer. We are recognizing the dangers of genetic technology around us right now. The food supply could be next.
Thank you all for that. And, you kind of anticipate my next question. One of the problems with a lot of these things is the structure of Congress. And I think people are mind blown to know that there's not a dedicated healthcare committee in Congress. I mean, there's a select committee on COVID, but all of the jurisdiction is broken up amongst multiple committees. And you could say, well, they'll eventually cover it, and isn't that great? I don't think so. And one of the biggest problems is all of the committees of jurisdiction have a subcommittee focused on oversight. And when you look at oversight on healthcare in America, the Energy and Commerce Committee, which deals with all kinds of things, is competing for time on this. And frankly, the Hospital Association, the Pharmaceutical Association, the health insurance lobbyists all spend a fortune making sure that we don't create a dedicated healthcare committee. It's 25% of the GDP. I mean, it's a huge part of the economy. It is one of the most broken parts of the economy for every household that I know. And while we do, as parties, have differences of views on what the solutions are, I think we share some frustration about the problems. And I just ask you guys, with the careers in healthcare, do you think we could actually do more good for solving some of these problems if we had a structural change in Congress where there was a dedicated healthcare committee?
I think that's a two-edged sword because it depends on who sits on that committee. I like to joke that no one of us is as dumb as all of us. And so I think it's a great idea because you do have to have structure and organization to keep things flowing forward. But again, it depends on how you man and woman that committee and appropriately have a vision for what healthcare should be, health and wellness. And we live in an era of wealth and wellness instead of health and wellness. And I think we need to flip the tables on that.
Just one quick comment. Another agency that's causing great concern now is the Federal Trade Commission. Early on in the pandemic, the Federal Trade Commission launched an all-out attack on companies that offered natural products, various natural products, to have them try to develop their products to help people through the pandemic, particularly the virucidal nasal sprays and washes or virostatic washes. It turns out there's been 17 prospective randomized clinical trials showing a simple nasal sprays and gargles reduce the risk of COVID-19, reduce the intensity and severity of COVID-19, reduce the risk of hospitalization and death. Congresswoman Nancy Mace, when she found out about this in 2021, she went nuts. There was a news piece saying, listen, why is our government not telling us about simple nasal sprays and gargles? Well, in our audience today is Nate Jones, who's the CEO of one of these companies. He's been tied up in court with the FTC and the FDA, not allowing his company to do research and develop products to help people through this. Now there is a move, not just in the United States, but worldwide, to restrict natural products from commercial use. This is occurring all over. Another manifestation of this biopharmaceutical complex. They want all the money spent on high dollar pharmaceuticals, not natural solutions that people can do it themselves. We have the FTC now as another agency. I'd say the USDA, the FDA, and the FTC. Remember, HHS is administering the programs, right? CMS, Medicare, what have you. They're basically, this is a very authoritarian structure. There's no committees to say, listen, does this make sense? Is this reasonable? And now we have these agencies that have been captured by these biopharmaceutical companies. They're running the table.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. My yield back.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Cole, you have some slides
And I can
that
fly
we'd like
through.
to look at. And if you could present those and I would enjoy, of course, and I'm sure everyone would, conversation on these.
And I'm going to fly through them real fast because I know time is limited. So this is a picture is worth 1,000 words. So whoever's got the computer over there and I say next, have your hot finger ready. Okay, here we go. Next, no conflicts next. Obviously, it's dangerous to be right in matters about which the established authorities are wrong. Next, all scientists agree when you censor the ones who don't. Next, okay, I'm going to get right to the pathology. So skip, 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 skip. There's the Cleveland Clinic study. More injections equals more infections, plain and simple. Next, 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 next. Next, maybe I should come over there. Okay, the cells don't lie. That's what I'm going to show you. Here are the cells. Okay, that's a needle going into the arm. That's a blood vessel next to that needle. Next, this is from the late, great Dr. Burkhart. That's a ruptured vessel. Now those lipid nanoparticles can go everywhere. Next, that's spike protein in the muscles of the arm being expressed, all those little brown dots.
Wait, can you describe a little bit more?
Yeah, so
For-
we,
I'm not a doctor.
yeah, so we make a special antibody in the lab that will bind to the spike protein, and then we put a little tail on it that makes it glow, and then anywhere it binds to, it glows. And in this case, we use a little dye that makes it show brown. So we know every one of those cells is expressing spike protein. So it was injected, the gene turned on, made spike protein attached to the surface of those cells. So that part was doing what it was supposed to do. However, we will see as we go on here. Next, the lipid nanoparticles we talked about, their harms next. This is the lipid nanoparticles accumulating. This is a Japanese study accumulating in the blood plasma, the whole blood, bone marrow, and see where that curve is going up? That's the lipid nanoparticles accumulating in the ovaries. Notice they cut that study off after 2 days. It was still accumulating. It was still going up. You'd never stop a study when it's still going up. Same in the bone marrow there. Next. These are all the chemicals that are in the lipid nanoparticles, not for human or veterinary use, went into billions of people. Next. This is the study that Dr. McCullough mentioned. This is the Roltgen study out of Stanford showing that the synthetic mRNA was still persistent 60 days later and still making spike protein. Next.
Wait,
Go back.
can you go back? So how are we seeing it's still
Okay.
there? Can you describe
Yeah,
that
so
a little
on the
bit?
left, you can see the pinkish color in each of those slides magnified 400 times. And you can see day 7, 16, 37, 42, and 60. Now, this wasn't every patient in the study that was still making it, but a significant percentage of patients were still making, still had the persistent synthetic RNA 60 days later. And on the right, you can see the little brown dots.
And that's the spike.
That's the spike
protein.
being made 60 days later in these patients after these synthetic injections. Okay, next, this is a study from Dr. Brogna that Dr. McCullough mentioned where we know that the vaccinal spike is circulating 6 months later in 50% of patients. Next, 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 next. Okay, so that spike protein lining a small blood vessel in the body, every brown dot. This is after injection. And like I said, it goes through circulation first. That initiates these clotting processes. Next.
So how is that directly after a vaccine?
That's
or-
within a few days after. Well, this patient was an autopsy series patient from Dr. Burkhart, and this patient died a couple months later and still was expressing spike protein in these tissues months after their last injection. One of the patients up to 123 days after death was still making spike protein in multiple organs in the body. Next, and here you can see a normal blood vessel on the left. Here you can see the immune system just collapsing and attacking that vessel on the right. in the
Wait, no,
vaccine.
I can't see anything but dots. So help
right,
me.
okay. All the red are red blood cells.
Okay.
All the blue are your white blood cells, your lymphocytes, your neutrophils, your eosinophils, et cetera, et cetera. So
Okay, so
that's the tube,
okay, thank you.
This is what was the tube.
and it's all filled with inflammation and destroyed.
All the purple dots are inflammatory cells. They
Yeah,
shouldn't
all the
be there.
purple dots are inflammation there, the
And-
nucleus of cells.
And what kind of symptoms is this person
Well,
having
that one,
I mean, that looks like a mess.
yeah, that one's
So what do you
death.
feel?
Yeah, death, unfortunately, in that patient.
That patient died. Most of the people in the Burkharts, they died of myocarditis, thrombotic complications, just these medical disasters, a few days, weeks, or a few months after the shots.
After being
Yeah.
vaccinated.
So when it causes a vasculitis, that means that all your blood vessels are inflamed. So it's not just in the arm. When people feel this horrible sensation, like they say they feel like they're going to die after being vaccinated, I've never felt so horrible in all my life. That is a sense of they have a whole body inflammation, and because it goes wherever the blood vessels are, and it affects the blood vessels, the interior cells called endothelial cells of the blood vessels. It goes everywhere.
And this is the problem of injecting a gene with no off switch. And in some people, they may have gotten that almost placebo-like batch, and other people got a lot of the gene and DNA contamination and whatnot. There is no regulatory mechanism. We don't know who's a spike factory and who's not, who's making a lot of these atypical foreign proteins, who's not. This is why it didn't happen to everybody, thankfully. But there's still so many millions of people around the world that have been harmed. And these are just some of the mechanisms.
Now there's 36 autopsy studies. People have taken the shot. The doctors think the shot caused the death. Autopsies were ordered. The autopsies were performed. The results were collated. We performed a systematic review and reviewed 600 papers where we thought there were autopsies, got down to these 36 papers, took all the individual data, dissected it all out, and had independent doctors review them. The answer is 74% of the time, we think what we're seeing here actually is the cause of death. Now, it's possible someone took the shot and they died of something else. And in 26% of the cases, it was something else. A nursing home patient took the shot, but they aspirated and died. And we looked at everything and said they died of the aspiration, even though but there are other ones, it was so clear. It was a blood clot. It was heart damage, an aortic dissection, a thrombotic or ischemic stroke. So as we sit here today, the next person who dies, where there's no antecedent illness, they just died. If the vaccine is in their background, we would conclude that on a more probable than not basis, they've died of the vaccine.
Talk about how reluctant the medical establishment has been to do autopsy.
Very. And that was Fauci early on, through kind of dictates through the agency. Oh, don't do autopsies. And then everybody was afraid early on. Everybody was afraid. Oh gosh, everybody treated COVID like it was Ebola. It wasn't. And so, pathologists, had the fear put into them as well. And so it was any unexpected death in a young, previously healthy patient, coroners, medical examiners always do an autopsy in an unexplained sudden death.
And we didn't do it.
And we didn't.
Well, they're obliged to. Now, during COVID, I was at a major medical center and I, was every week in the pathology lab. We actually suspended autopsies because of the fear of contracting COVID from the autopsy. And it was the Italians that first published the very valuable studies where they finally had the courage to do an autopsy. And they found people who died of COVID, they actually died of blood clots in the lungs, these micro blood clots. That was the very, very important finding. Now these deaths are coming in after the vaccine. Now, prior to the pandemic, pull a typical obituary or pull a typical press release on a death of a prominent person. It'll say they died of a long battle with cancer or they died in complications after heart surgery. That's before the pandemic. Early on in the vaccine program, there were deaths that occurred. There was a CNN correspondent, legal correspondent who died. It said she took the vaccines and she died of an allergic reaction to the vaccine. That was in 2021. Then there was a change. And now all the reports are someone died. It's a mystery. There's no explanation of the death. The cause of death is not known. Let me tell you, before the pandemic, the cause of death was always known. In the United States, of adults, 40% die of known heart disease, a known heart attack, a known long history of heart failure. 40% die of known cancer. It's known. They have cancer, long history of cancer, and 20% other known causes, drug overdose, suicide, car accident, trauma. It's known. People just don't die for unknown reasons. Since the mass vaccination campaign has come on, we are inundated with report after report after report of just deaths with no cause. Our data suggests that, in fact, the vaccine is the cause of death.
And I can show that real quick. Just a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm gonna fly. This is that atypical amyloid protein in a heart blood vessel. That little blob in the middle. Yeah, the body doesn't break that down. Cardiac death. Yes. Next. Large vessel destruction. Next. This is the aorta, the biggest vessel in your body coming off your heart. On the right, that's the gross picture of the aorta, that big brown line in the middle. That's where the wall of it has been blown apart. And that's because all these fibers up at the purple on the left are being pushed apart by inflammation. If we go to the next picture, please. Every brown dot in the wall of this aorta, that's cells that have spike protein in them. And then that's a foreign protein being made by these cells. And then the immune cells, your killer T cells, come in, and your macrophages, they start destroying the tissue. And then that aorta blows apart and you die instantly.
So if this person had not been vaccinated, we would see none of these spike protein cells,
would not.
correct?
So obvious.
Yeah.
It's being so ignored.
It's blatantly obvious to the most casual observer.
So
And you don't have to be a pathologist to look at this and go, gosh, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. You know, this is Sesame Street. This is brown dots that are death.
in a basic situation, we know this is a horrible protein. We know this virus is not that serious. And we're asking our body, our public health strategy right now is asking our body to make a toxic chemical, a cardiac toxin that goes all throughout our body.
Mhm.
That's our strategy right now. And we're going, guys, it's not working.
But again, we were told
Oh, it's working.
we were
Killing
told it was going to
people.
stay right there,
Right.
even though they knew through studies it was going to biodistribute all over the place. They knew the lipid nanoparticle goes everywhere. They knew. So that's part of the problem here.
Yeah.
Is we had federal health officials lie bold-faced to the American public,
Correct.
and they still are.
They are. It's still on their web pages, recommending boosters.
And they're preventing us at every opportunity to try to get this information out. They're not letting publications be printed. We're being silenced at every step. We're being ridiculed. We have ad hominem attacks.
Well, you have pharmaceutical companies sponsoring all the legacy media, big TV shows. There are 2 nations in the world that allow pharma to advertise on TV, New Zealand and the US. The rest of the world doesn't allow it.
The BBC announced on December 10th, 2020, the Trusted News Initiative. And it said on December 10th, and this is before the vaccines are released to the public, they said, we are going to have a very carefully coordinated news content mediation program across all major media in order to stamp out dangerous vaccine misinformation. How did they know? The vaccines weren't released yet. How did they know there was going to be dangerous vaccine misinformation? Senator mentioned Event 201.
They knew it back then.
Where they knew then, they have to so there was a presumption that the vaccines were going to be safe and effective, and that the bad guy there was vaccine hesitancy. So they were going to stamp out any vaccine hesitancy. Well, you look at the slide, you become very hesitant to take one of these shots. I don't want this stuff in my aorta and have my aorta rip and have a catastrophe. So there is a coordinated program to suppress any information on safety. Recently, a paper that's been reviewed, it's on my Substack, analyzed YouTube. And they analyzed YouTube's use of hashtags. And YouTube had a coordinated, any hashtag that would say vaccine side effect, they were suppressing that. And it also was done on Twitter. This analysis, I believe, was in Twitter at the time. So people worldwide were blindsided by this safety information. It didn't have a chance to get out to them. They didn't have a chance to learn this fairly. And it wasn't, and to this day is not being presented to them. There are TV commercials that's put forward by Pfizer, Moderna, HHS, and the CDC, all saying, take a vaccine, without giving the standard disclaimers that could cause a fatal side effect. Every other drug has to have a disclaimer. That should be a red flag.
that all gets back to the liability protection for the vaccines versus treatments.
That's right.
You know, they suppressed all the information on treatments. You talked about gargling. There's a study on the CDC's website. I'm doing a telephone town hall. I mentioned to, my constituents is Omicron's coming up and people are less concerned about it. I said, no, be concerned about the things you can do. Vitamin D, vitamin C, gargle.
Yep.
I was ridiculed and vilified for 2 weeks saying that I told my constituents that Listerine would replace the vaccine.
Oh my
So,
God.
so I'm going to have to hit the road. Just a couple closing comments here. We talked about how the federal health agencies have just lied to us. A complete lack of transparency. They've been dishonest. They didn't talk about the biodistribution. They completely, Dr. Milhoan, you're talking about what a marvel the body is, our natural immunity. They denied natural immunity. Again, it was all because they denied the effectiveness of therapeutics, all because they wanted the vaccine, because they have no liability protection. They can crank out billions of doses. They can suppress the safety signals, and they can make billions and billions of dollars. And I think what is most telling is, again, we just have these wonderful people, okay, great doctors that have the courage and compassion to treat patients. The events I've had, I don't know if you invited anybody, but I would always invite the heads of the FDA, the CDC, or their representatives, Peter Marks, come on. You're saying these folks are spreading disinformation? Come and discuss it with them. Challenge what they're saying. Same with the heads or representatives of Big Pharma. They won't do it. I think the more famous one right now is Peter Hotez. What is it up to? $2.6 million?
Yeah,
We'll give you
Rogan,
$2.6 million to your favorite charity. All you have to do is come in as a doctor, debate a lawyer about vaccines, and he won't do it.
Wow.
To me, that is so telling. So again, I just want to summarize. Thank you for holding this. This has been just an absolutely excellent hearing. You have done a marvelous job laying this information out in layman's terms. I encourage everybody who's watched this, spread the information. More people have to see this, and I am just begging other doctors, open your eyes, open your hearts. Your patients depend on you to be honest. You have to have this information. So again, Congresswoman Greene, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you, doctors.
Thank you, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate you being able to attend.
Yeah.
Is there any more scary slides to look at?
I have plenty. You got the concept. Let's just say this shows up in the heart, shows up in the brain, shows up in the adrenal, shows up in the liver, shows up in the spleen, shows up in any large and small vessel in the body. This is ubiquitous in the body. I won't belabor the point. You have the construct. I'm not going to turn you into a pathologist in 5 minutes. But this is the kind of science that has to be out there and published. To Senator Johnson's point, people need to know.
Absolutely.
And I mean, Smith-Mundt Act needs to be overturned. 2012, when we're allowed to use propaganda on the American people, it used to be overseas. Now, under Obama, 2012 Smith-Mundt Act allowing to propagandize the American people. We need to overturn that. That's another thing Congress can do. The people need trust in their doctor, in the government, trust in society. And I will conclude just by saying that's very easy, truth plus transparency. And thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. So I heard one good action item here today, and that is to ban the mRNA technology. Is that correct, gentlemen?
Well, I think for research purposes, it's okay. But widespread use in a population, it is not safe.
Not safe. Absolutely not. Thank you so much for being here. And again, I hope everyone shares this video. I appreciate the information. And again, a picture that you showed us today is worth 1,000 words. Bad stuff. Glad I didn't take the vaccine, but I'm also concerned for those that did. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really was excellent. Let's just start working
Let's work
way
together.